Assalamu alaikum, Nazreen. The morning had barely opened its eyes upon the city of Bursa, when the first whisper of what was to come settled like dew upon the stone courtyards and the dust-laden roads that wound through the heart of the Sultanate. The sun had not yet climbed above the eastern ridgeline, and the sky held that particular shade of iron and pearl that belongs only to the moments before the world decides whether it will offer mercy or ruin. And it was in this half-light, in this breath between darkness and dawn, that we find Evranosh Saheb standing beside his horse in the outer courtyard of the fortress, his hand resting upon the saddle, his gaze turned inward as though he were reading something written not upon parchment, but upon the surface of his own restless soul. He had been standing there for some time. The horse shifted beneath his touch, sensing perhaps what its rider could not yet name. The air smelled of cedar smoke and old rain. The walls of Bursa rose behind him like the spine of a sleeping giant, and the silence was the kind that does not comfort but instead presses down upon the chest and demands that a man confront whatever it is he has been avoiding. And then Fatima came. She appeared from beyond the archway, moving with that particular grace that belongs to women who have carried burdens heavier than their frames should allow and yet have never once let the weight bend their backs. Her footsteps were soft against the flagstones, but Evranosh heard them before he saw her, because a man who is waiting for someone always hears them first in his heart and only afterward with his ears. He turned and she was smiling. Evranosh Saheb, she said, and the way she spoke his name carried within it something that had not been there before, a lightness, a release, as though a knot that had been pulled tight for months had finally loosened and allowed the blood to flow again. Evranosh looked at her and said, "Fatima Khatun, when you smile like that, it brings me a happiness I cannot easily put into words." She stepped closer and the smile did not fade. "My brother has forgiven me," she said. "The weight that sat upon my shoulders has been lifted. Every burden I carried, every guilt that pressed against my ribs when I tried to sleep, it is gone now. He has forgiven me." Evranosh closed his eyes for a single breath and then opened them again and said, "All praise belongs to Allah. He has shown his mercy. And soon, very soon, your brother will forgive me as well." Fatima nodded and said, "Yes, yes, he will." And there was a moment between them, brief and weightless, where neither spoke and neither needed to, because sometimes silence between two people who understand each other is more eloquent than any declaration. Then Evranosh shifted his stance and looked at her with an expression that sat somewhere between earnestness and the nervous energy of a man who knows he is about to say something that may not be received the way he hopes. And he said, "Fatima, I want to say something. Since you do not have too many duties pressing upon you at this moment, perhaps you should begin thinking about your dowry." The smile on Fatima's face changed. It did not disappear, but it sharpened at the edges, the way a blade catches light differently when you turn it, and she said, "Look at you. There are still 100 things to be done, Evranosh Saheb, and here you are, interfering in my affairs before we are even married. We have not yet stood before anyone to make our vows, and already you are telling me what I should be doing with my time." Evranosh raised his hands slightly, the gesture of a man who realizes he has stepped into territory more dangerous than any battlefield, and said, "I am not interfering. I am not, but we are going to be married, and I do not want you to exhaust yourself later trying to prepare everything at once. I am thinking of you." Fatima straightened her back and said, "I am the leader of the Bazian. I carry responsibilities that do not pause because a man wishes to discuss household preparations. And besides, I already have a dowry. Do you not remember?" Evranosh said, "I do not want that one." Fatima's eyebrows rose and she said, "Allah, Allah. So now you will choose the dowry as well. You will decide what is acceptable and what is not. Before you start redesigning my trousseau, perhaps you should first obtain my brother's approval. Let us see whether he even allows us to marry." Something flickered in Evranosh's expression, a shadow of doubt passing across features that were otherwise composed, and he said, "Could it happen that he would not give his permission?" Fatima looked at him steadily and said, "I do not know. That depends on you. It depends on who you bring with you when you go to seek his blessing." Evranosh blinked and said, "Who I bring with me? I cannot do this alone." Fatima allowed herself a small, knowing look and said, "My brother and my mother will send you in circles. They will test you. They will make you wait. You will not obtain their consent on your first attempt. That is how it has always been. That is how it will be." Evranosh said, "First attempt. What about the second? I will ask a second time if I must. Tell me how many times I will need to do this." And here Fatima paused, and the playfulness in her expression gave way to something more complex, something that carried within it the memory of other men, other proposals, other days when she had stood in rooms like this and heard words of devotion that ultimately proved hollow, and she said, "There was someone who came 3 times, 3 separate visits, and still he could not have me. Not everyone can, Evranosh. Not everyone who wants something deserves to receive it." Evranosh went very still. The horse behind him stamped once and then settled. The air between them changed, thickened with a tension that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the particular species of jealousy that lives inside the chest of a man who loves deeply and cannot bear the thought that others have stood where he now stands. "Who was it?" he said, and his voice was quieter now, controlled in the way that voices become controlled when the emotion behind them is too large to release. "Besides Yakid, who else was there?" Fatima shook her head and said, "It does not matter. You should not be told these things. Focus on what lies ahead. Think about who you will bring with you to ask for my hand." But Evranosh did not move on. He said, "Who wanted to marry you, Fatima? Tell me." Fatima sighed and said, "Evranosh, I cannot keep every name stored in my mind. There were many, I did not catalogue them." Evranosh's voice rose just slightly, not in anger, but in the bewildered distress of a man confronting arithmetic he had not anticipated. He said, "Everyone. How many is everyone?" And Fatima, seeing that she had wound this thread as far as it would usefully go, simply said, "I am leaving now. We will meet again later." She turned and began to walk away. Evranosh called after her, "Wait, who wanted you?" "Fatima, you said everyone. How many?" "Fatima, how many?" But Fatima did not answer, she did not turn. She walked through the archway and disappeared into the interior of the fortress, leaving Evranosh standing beside his horse with his questions unanswered and his heart beating faster than he would have liked to admit, because the truth is that a man can face 1,000 enemies with his sword drawn and never flinch, but the thought that the woman he loves was desired by others before him, this is the wound that no armor can protect against, this is the blade that finds the gap between the ribs. And the morning continued. Elsewhere in a part of the world that smelled of pine resin and wet earth, and the slow decay of leaves that had fallen in autumn and never been cleared, the forest stretched out in every direction like a sea of shadows. The trees here were old, their trunks thick and scarred, their branches interlocking overhead to create a canopy so dense that even at midday the light that reached the forest floor was green and diffuse and uncertain, as though the sun itself was reluctant to witness what happened in these woods. It was through this forest that Andreas rode. His horse was lathered and breathing hard, its hooves striking the earth with a rhythm that spoke of urgency rather than leisure, and Andreas himself sat in the saddle with the posture of a man who has not slept in days, and is being sustained not by rest, but by the particular kind of fuel that burns hottest and leaves nothing behind, which is rage. He came upon a small house set back from the narrow track, a structure so modest and so deliberately unremarkable that a traveller passing at speed might not have noticed it at all. Its walls were rough stone, its roof was timber and earth, and its single window was shuttered from the inside. There was a man standing outside, armed but not aggressively so, watching the tree line with the practiced alertness of someone who has been posted as a guard and takes the duty seriously enough to stay awake, but not seriously enough to stand at full attention. Andreas dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, swinging his leg over and dropping to the ground with a heaviness that sent a jolt through his knees, and he strode toward the door and said to the guard, "Where is she?" "Inside," the guard said. Andreas pushed the door open and stepped across the threshold and said, "Leave us alone." And the guard, who was wise enough to recognize a command that was not a request, disappeared into the trees without another word. The interior of the house was dim. A single oil lamp burned on a rough wooden table, and its light painted the walls in shades of amber and shadow. The air smelled of herbs, poultice, dried blood, and something else beneath it all, something that might have been despair or might have been determination, because the two often smell the same. And there on a low pallet against the far wall, wrapped in cloth bandages that were stained with the rust-brown evidence of wounds recently tended, lay Daphne. She was not dead. This was, in its way, a miracle, because the people who had done this to her had intended her to die. They had left her for dead. They had walked away from her broken body, with the assumption that the earth would receive her, and the matter would be closed. But Daphne had refused the earth's invitation. She had clung to consciousness with fingers that were torn and bleeding, and she had dragged herself from the place where they had left her, and she had survived, not because her body was strong enough to survive, but because her will was stronger than her body, and her fury was stronger than her will. Andreas crossed the room and knelt beside her, and said, "Daphne, my love." Her eyes opened, they were clouded with pain but clear with purpose, and she said, "Andreas." "I am here," he said, "I am here, my love. Praise God that you are alive. When I received word, when they told me what had been done to you, I feared the worst. But you are here, you are breathing. Allah be praised, you are alive." Daphne looked at him and said, "The thing that kept me alive was vengeance. Do not mistake my survival for luck, Andreas. Luck had nothing to do with it. I refused to die because dying would have meant letting them win, and I will not let them win. Andreas gripped her hand and said, "Do not worry, my love. I will take your revenge for them. I will find every one of them. I will make them regret that you still draw breath. They will wish they had finished what they started, because what I will do to them will be worse, far worse than what they did to you." But Daphne shook her head, and the movement cost her, a wince passing across her features like a crack spreading through ice, but her voice when she spoke was steady and cold, and carried within it the weight of a plan already formed. "No," she said, "no, Andreas." He looked at her, confusion replacing fury for a brief moment. "What do you mean?" "They will come to their own deaths," she said. "They will walk toward destruction of their own accord. We do not need to chase them. We need only to prepare the ground and wait." Andreas leaned closer and said, "Daphne, they nearly killed you. They left you broken and bleeding in the dark. How can you ask me to wait? How can you expect me to sit here and do nothing while the men who did this to you walk freely under the same sky?" Daphne's eyes found his and held them, and in that gaze was something that Andreas recognized, because he had seen it before in the eyes of commanders who have lost a battle, but not a war, the cold certainty of someone who has already calculated every move that remains to be made and knows exactly where each piece must be placed upon the board. "It will not take long," she said. "Do not worry, they are already moving toward us. They do not know it yet, but every step they take brings them closer to the trap." Andreas was quiet for a moment, and then he said, How will this happen?" Daphne said, "Prepare a ship for me. I am going to Constantinople." The words fell into the silence of the room like stones dropped into still water, and Andreas felt the ripples move through him, because Constantinople was not simply a city, it was the center of an empire, the heart of a power that had shaped the world for 1,000 years, and to go there in Daphne's condition, wounded and hunted and carrying secrets that could ignite wars, this was not a journey, this was a declaration. He looked at her for a long moment, reading her face the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm, and then he said, "Very well." Daphne closed her eyes and lay back, and the oil lamp flickered, and the shadows on the walls shifted and resettled, and outside the small stone house the forest continued its ancient, indifferent breathing, unconcerned with the plans of mortals, unconcerned with revenge or love or the slow, patient accumulation of power that Daphne was even now assembling behind her closed eyelids like a general arranging troops on a field that no one else could see. And the day moved on. Back in Bursa, within the fortress whose walls had witnessed the rise of a dynasty and the fall of empires, the corridors were cool and quiet in the way that stone corridors always are, holding within themselves the echoes of every conversation ever spoken in their presence. And it was through these corridors that Zarkute walked with the unhurried stride of a man who has lived long enough to know that most emergencies are not emergencies at all, but merely the anxieties of younger men who have not yet learned to distinguish between what is urgent and what is important. He found Evranosh in his quarters, standing at the window and staring out at the courtyard below with the fixed intensity of someone who is not actually seeing what is in front of him, but is instead looking at something else entirely, something that exists only in the landscape of his own troubled thoughts. Zarkute entered and observed this for a moment, and then said, "Is everything well, Evranosh? You are lost in thoughts so deep that I wonder whether you will need a rope to climb back out." Evranosh turned from the window and sat down beside Zarkute and said, "Zarkute Saheb, I need to ask you something." Zarkute settled himself comfortably and said, "Ask, but if you do not like the answer, do not hold it against me." Evranosh said, "I will try." And then he paused, and the pause was the kind that a man takes when he is about to ask a question whose answer he is not entirely sure he wants to hear, and then he said, "How many proposals have come for Fatima Khatun's hand? How many men have asked to marry her?" Zarkute's expression changed. He grew thoughtful. He raised one hand and began counting on his fingers, touching each fingertip to his thumb in the methodical way of a man performing arithmetic that he expects to be straightforward, but the counting continued. One hand was exhausted. He moved to the second hand. The fingers kept moving. His brow furrowed. He looked up at the ceiling as though additional names might be written there. He looked back at his hands. He ran out of fingers. Evranosh watched this performance with growing alarm, his face passing through several distinct stages of dismay, like a man watching clouds gather over a field he has just planted. Zarkute finally lowered his hands and said, "No, I cannot count them. There are too many." Evranosh said, "What do you mean, too many?" Zarkute said, "I mean that my fingers are not sufficient for the task. Many proposals have come for Fatima Khatun. Many men have sought her hand. She is the sister of the Sultan. She is beautiful. She is capable. She leads the Bazian. What did you expect, that no one else would notice?" Evranosh's composure cracked along lines that had been forming all morning, and he said, "What are you saying, Zarkute? This many people. Who are they? Do we know them? Are they among us? Do I see them every day? Do I sit beside them at council and not know that they once looked at the woman I love and wanted her for themselves?" Zarkute raised both hands in a calming gesture and said, "Enough. Stop. Do not do this to yourself. Listen to me. 10 men can send a proposal for one woman. 20 men can desire her. 100 men can whisper her name in the privacy of their own hearts, but only one man will marry her. Only one will stand beside her and speak the words that bind them before God. And that man, Evranosh, is you." Evranosh exhaled and said, "Inshallah, inshallah, let it be so." And then his relief lasted approximately 3 seconds before the next wave of anxiety arrived, and he said, "But they will give her to me, will they not? They will say yes." Zarkute said, "Yes, they will say yes, eventually." Evranosh either did not hear the word eventually or chose to ignore it, and he said, "But there is a problem. A real problem. I have no one, Zarkute Saheb, no family of my own to bring. When a man goes to ask for a woman's hand, he brings his father, his uncles, his elders, the men of weight and reputation who stand behind him and vouch for his character. I have none of these. I converted to this faith. I left my old life behind. I have no one to take with me." Zarkute looked at him with an expression that blended affection and exasperation in equal measure, and he said, "No one. What am I then? Am I invisible? Am I a phantom standing before you? Am I not sitting right here in this very room? You have me, Evranosh. We will go together. We will walk through that door. We will sit at that table. I will place my fist upon that table if necessary. We will speak with them. We will negotiate. And we will bring Fatima Khatun home with honor and dignity. Do you understand me?" Evranosh's eyes brightened and he began to speak, but before he could form the words, the door to the chamber opened and Nasa Celebi entered with the particular energy of a man who has overheard something through a wall and has decided that propriety is less important than participation. "My lords," Nasa Celebi said, "include me in this endeavor. I will go with you. We will go together, the three of us. We will ask for her hand. We will present our case. And by the command of Allah, we will succeed." Zarkute gestured toward Nasa and said to Evranosh, "You see, now you have 2 men standing with you. 2 is better than none, and by tomorrow there may be 3, and by the day after that an entire delegation. You are not alone." Evranosh looked from one to the other and said, "Thank you, Nasa. Thank you both. I am fortunate beyond measure to have men such as you beside me, but Fatima Khatun herself told me something that concerns me. She said that they will not give permission the first time. She said the family always refuses the first proposal. Is this true?" Zarkute nodded slowly and said, "It is true. They will not say yes the first time you ask. This is tradition. This is the way things are done. The first refusal is not a refusal of you, it is a test, a demonstration of the family's respect for the weight of the commitment being made. They turn you away not because you are unworthy, but because they want you to prove that you are serious enough to return." Evranosh absorbed this and said, "Then how many times must we go?" Zarkute opened his mouth to answer and then closed it again, and his expression shifted into something more serious, and he said, "Evranosh, the number of visits is not the real problem." Evranosh said, "Then what is the real problem?" Zarkute said, "The real problem is larger, much larger." Evranosh leaned forward and said, What is the real problem? Tell me." Zarkute looked at him squarely and said, "The real problem is this. Our Sultan Orhan Saheb, he will not object. Malhun Khatun, she will not stand in the way. They love you, they respect you. They know what you have done for this dynasty and they will not refuse you. But there is one person, Evranosh, one person whose demands may prove more challenging than any siege you have ever faced, and that is Alidin Saheb." The name fell into the room like a stone into a well, and the silence that followed was the silence of recognition, because everyone in Bursa knew Alidin, the Sultan's brother, a man of formidable intelligence and even more formidable parsimony, a man who examined every transaction as though it were a treaty with a hostile power, who weighed every coin as though the fate of the state depended upon it, and who, when it came to matters of family honor and material exchange, operated with a ruthlessness that would have impressed the merchants of every great city from Baghdad to Constantinople. Nasa Celebi, who had been nodding along with increasing vigor, now added his own contribution to the mounting anxiety in the room. He said, "The man who made me build a bridge in 2 days, may Allah protect us all, that man is capable of demanding gold equal to Fatima Khatun's weight. I have seen the way he operates. Nothing is beyond the scope of his negotiating position." Zarkute said, "Yes, he could very well demand that." Evranosh stood up from his seat as though an electric current had passed through the stone beneath him, and he said, "Gold equal to Fatima Khatun's weight. Are you serious? Where am I supposed to find that kind of gold? I do not possess such wealth. I am a soldier. I am a commander. I have given my life and my sword to this dynasty, but my coffers are not overflowing with treasure. I am not a merchant prince. I am not the heir to some vast fortune. Where will this gold come from? Zarkute looked at him calmly and said, You do not have it. Evranosh said, No, I do not have it. Zarkute said, Then without gold you cannot take her, not in this life, not ever. You cannot walk into the house of the Sultan's family with empty pockets and expect to walk out with his sister. That is not how this world works, and especially not the Sultan's sister. Alidin Saheb would sooner give his own blood than let a bride leave his household without the proper mahr being paid in full. Evranosh sank back down and put his head in his hands and said, Then I am ruined. Everything I have fought for, everything I have sacrificed, and I am defeated not by an army or a fortress or an enemy blade, but by a pile of gold I do not possess. Zarkute watched him for a moment, and then he placed his hand upon Evranosh's shoulder and said, Listen to me. Do not despair. Focus on what is in front of you. Focus on your duties. Come, let us go and pray. Allah is greater than any obstacle, greater than any mountain of gold, greater than any demand that any man can make. We will pray and we will ask for his help, and he will provide. He always provides for those who trust in him. Do not be troubled. Come, stand up. He pulled Evranosh to his feet. Prayer is the remedy for every affliction, Zarkute said. It is the answer to every question. It is the door that opens when every other door is closed. Do not be distressed. Come. And as they walked toward the door, Zarkute added with the faintest trace of gentle humor, And stop worrying as though there are no other women in the world. There are, but the one you want, we will get her for you. Inshallah. And they left the room, the three of them, Evranosh and Zarkute and Nasa Celebi, and they walked through the corridors of the Bursa fortress toward the prayer hall, their footsteps falling in an uneven rhythm against the stone, and the echoes of their passage lingered in the empty room behind them like the last notes of a song that has not yet decided how it wishes to end. And so the morning turned. And the affairs of the heart gave way, as they always must, to the affairs of the state, because a sultan does not have the luxury of attending to one world at a time. The world presses in from every direction, and each direction brings its own demands, its own crises, its own impossible choices, and the man who wears the crown must stand at the center of all of it and decide, again and again, what matters most in this hour, in this moment, in this breath. It was in the next scene of this unfolding day that we find Nasa Celebi walking beside Sultan Orhan Saheb through the inner corridors of the palace, their conversation carrying the weight of matters far removed from weddings and dowries and the tender negotiations of the heart. The walls here were thicker, the air cooler, and the light came not from windows but from oil lamps set in iron brackets, so that their shadows moved ahead of them and behind them simultaneously, as though even their shadows were uncertain which direction to take. Nasa Celebi was speaking, and his voice carried the particular tone of a man delivering a report that he knows will not be well received, but that he is obligated to deliver nonetheless. My Sultan, he said, as I mentioned before, there are several fortresses along our borders that require significant repair and reinforcement before we can consider advancing our position. The walls are crumbling in places, the gates are weakened, the watchtowers have been compromised by weather and age, and in some cases by the projectiles of enemies past. I have assigned soldiers to the work, but our numbers are insufficient. The task is too large for military labor alone. I therefore requested workers from among the common people, from the villages and towns within our territory, to assist in the construction. Sultan Orhan Saheb continued walking, his expression composed but attentive, and he said, completing Nasa's thought with the precision of a ruler who already knows where every road leads, but the people objected. Nasa nodded. Yes, my Sultan, they objected. They said that being compelled to work on the fortresses took them away from their own fields, their own trades, their own livelihoods, and they went further. They have obtained a fatwa from the Qazi, a formal religious ruling declaring that such compulsory labor is not permissible under Islamic law. The Sultan stopped walking. The corridor around them seemed to grow quieter, as though even the stones understood that a moment of consequence had arrived. The lamplight steadied, the air held itself still. Orhan Saheb turned to the Qazi, who had been walking a few paces behind, and said, Qazi Effendi, tell me plainly, is what Nasa Celebi has done contrary to the Sharia? The Qazi was an older man, his beard white, his eyes careful, his spine straight with the posture of a man who carries the weight of divine law upon his shoulders and has never once permitted it to bend him. He said, My Sultan, if the people are not willing, then it is not permissible. The law is clear on this matter. A man's labor belongs to him, and it cannot be taken from him against his will, not by a governor, not by a commander, not even by a sultan. This is the protection that the Sharia affords to every soul under its governance. The Sultan looked at the Qazi for a long moment, and then he looked at Nasa Celebi, and in his eyes was not anger, but the quiet calculation of a ruler who understands that the gap between what is necessary and what is lawful is the space in which empires are either built or destroyed. Outside in the courtyard, the women of the household had gathered. Malhun Khatun stood at the center, her presence calm and anchoring, the way a great tree anchors the earth around its roots. Nilufer was beside her, and with Nilufer was her young son Murad, a boy whose eyes already carried something of the weight that would one day be his inheritance, though he could not yet know it and would not understand it for many years to come. Fatima was there, Halima was there. The other women of the household and of the Bazian were present, arranged not formally but naturally, in the way that people arrange themselves when they are waiting for something that they know is coming but cannot yet see. And then Princess Aspercha descended from the upper chambers and joined them. She came down the stone stairway with a measured step, and Halima, seeing her, leaned toward Fatima and said in a low voice, "The princess has come." Fatima gave her a look that was both a warning and a request, and said, "Halima, do not make a spectacle. Let her be." Aspercha took her place among them, and her gaze, though she tried to conceal it, drifted toward young Murad with an attention that was quiet and sustained, and that Nilufer noticed but did not acknowledge, because some observations are better stored than spoken. And then Ayaz appeared at the courtyard entrance and raised his voice in the formal announcement that preceded every appearance of the Sultan, and said, "By your leave, Sultan Orhan Ghazi Hazrat approaches." And the Sultan emerged into the daylight. He stood before them, and the sunlight fell upon his face, and for a moment he was not a ruler burdened by the weight of 1,000 decisions, but simply a man standing in his own courtyard, looking at the people who depended upon him, the people he loved, the people for whom he would sacrifice everything, and knowing that what he was about to say carried consequences that would ripple outward through the weeks and months and years to come. He turned to the Qazi and said, "We must not be hasty in deciding this matter, Qazi Effendi. These are deep waters, and a man who rushes through deep waters drowns. Let us think carefully. Let us weigh every consideration." Then he turned to Khalil, who stood nearby, and said, "Khalil, you have served as Qazi in Bilesik. You have studied the law. You have applied it in circumstances both ordinary and extraordinary. Tell me, what is your view on this matter?" Khalil stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the measured clarity of a scholar who has spent years learning not only what the law says but why it says it, and more importantly, what happens when the letter of the law and the spirit of the law pull in different directions. "My Sultan," he said, "the Qazi Effendi's position is that we are compelling people to work for the state, and in doing so, we are preventing them from earning their own livelihood and conducting their own affairs. And in this, he is correct. The law protects a man's right to his own labor. This is fundamental. This cannot be dismissed." He paused, and the pause was deliberate, and into it, he placed the single word that changed everything. "However," he said, "however, there is another principle that must be considered. Allah the Most High has commanded every Muslim to defend the lands of Islam with his life and his wealth. This is not a suggestion. This is not a recommendation. This is a divine obligation. Jihad in its truest and broadest sense is not limited to the battlefield. The strengthening of a fortress that protects Muslim lives and Muslim lands is itself an act of jihad. It is a contribution to the defense of the faith. And this obligation falls upon every member of the community." He let this settle, and then he continued, "Therefore I propose a solution that honors both principles. From every household in which at least 2 able-bodied men reside, 1 man shall be called to serve in the construction effort. This ensures that no household is left without a provider. No family loses its ability to sustain itself. The burden is shared and the work is accomplished. The fortresses are strengthened, the borders are secured, and the people are not oppressed. This is the path that walks between the 2 demands." The Sultan listened, and when Khalil had finished, Orhan Sahib said a single word that carried within it the weight of approval and the recognition of wisdom. "Excellent," he said. And then he turned back to the Qazi and said, "I will consider this matter fully. I will deliberate, and when I have reached my decision I will announce it. You may go now." Nasser Celebi stepped forward and guided the Qazi Effendi away, and the courtyard returned to its state of waiting, because the decision had not yet been made, and until a sultan speaks his final word, everything remains suspended, everything remains possible, and the future holds its breath. And it was here, Nazreen, in this suspended moment, in this breath between the question and the answer, between the proposal and the response, between the wound and the healing, that the threads of the day converged and revealed the pattern that had been forming all along. Because this was not simply a day of domestic negotiations and legal disputes and the rebuilding of walls. This was a day in which the foundations of what was to come were being laid, stone by invisible stone, in every conversation and every silence, in every glance exchanged and every word withheld. Evranosh, standing before the challenge of winning Fatima's hand, was learning that the battles of the heart require weapons that cannot be forged in any smithy, patience and humility, and the willingness to return again and again to doors that have been closed in your face. Daphne, lying wounded in a forest hovel, was demonstrating that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who charges at you with a sword, but the one who lies still and waits and plans, and lets you walk into the trap that was dug before you even knew the ground beneath your feet was hollow. And Sultan Orhan Saheb, standing at the intersection of law and necessity, of justice and security, of the rights of the individual and the survival of the state, was facing the same question that every ruler in every age must eventually face, the question of how to build something that lasts without destroying the very people you are trying to protect. These were the questions that hung in the air of Bursa that day, suspended like dust motes in the lamplight, turning slowly, catching the light, refusing to settle. And beyond the walls of the city, beyond the forests where Daphne plotted, and the roads where messengers rode, and the watchtowers where sentries squinted at the horizon, the world continued its slow, relentless turning. Wars were being planned in rooms that no one could see. Alliances were being whispered into existence over cups of wine in Constantinople. Traitors were sharpening their resolve alongside their blades. And somewhere, in a direction that had not yet been determined, the next crisis was already forming, gathering strength, preparing to arrive. Because the war was not over. It is never over. The sword may be sheathed, the treaty may be signed, the fortress may be rebuilt and the walls made strong. But as long as men desire power and fear losing it, as long as empires rise and fall and rise again from their own ashes, as long as there are those who believe that the world belongs to them by right and those who know that the world belongs only to Allah, the war continues. It continues in the councils of kings and the prayers of the faithful. It continues in the quiet determination of a woman who refuses to die and the desperate longing of a man who cannot afford the gold to buy his happiness. It continues in the ink of the scholar and the steel of the soldier and the tears of the mother who sends her son to the frontier, not knowing whether he will return. It continues. It always continues. And on this day in the fortress of Bursa, under a sky that could not decide whether to offer mercy or ruin, Sultan Orhan Ghazi Hazrat stood at the center of it all and carried the weight, because that is what sultans do, that is what leaders do, that is what men of faith do when the world places its impossible demands upon their shoulders and gives them no choice but to stand and bear it and find a way forward through the darkness toward whatever light remains. The day was not finished, the story was not finished, the decisions that had been deferred would demand to be made, the proposals that had been postponed would demand to be answered, the ships that had been requested would need to be prepared, the fortresses that needed rebuilding would not rebuild themselves, the enemies that had been wounded but not destroyed would heal and return with sharper blades and colder hearts. And the people of this world, the Evranoshes and the Fatimas, the Zarkutes and the Nasser-Celebis, the Daphnes and the Andreses, the sultans and the Kazis and the soldiers and the builders and the mothers and the sons, they would all wake tomorrow and face it again, because that is what it means to be alive in a time of consequence. That is what it means to exist in an age when every choice carries weight, and every silence speaks volumes, and every dawn brings with it the possibility of triumph or catastrophe in equal and indistinguishable measure. The sun moved across the sky above Bursa, the shadows lengthened, the call to prayer rose from the minaret and hung in the air like a thread connecting earth to heaven. And the war went on. And so now we are told that on the following morning the air above Bursa was different. There was something metallic in it, something that tasted of iron and intention, and the clouds that had gathered overnight had not departed with the dawn, but instead had pressed lower, closer to the rooftops, as though they wished to eavesdrop on the conversations of men who believed themselves hidden beneath walls and ceilings and stone. Orhan Saheb had not slept well. He had lain in his chamber with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling beams, his mind turning over Carl's words and the Kazi's objections, and the larger question that lay beneath both like the bedrock beneath a riverbed, the question of what a state owes its people and what its people owe the state, and whether these two debts can ever be made to balance. He rose before the Fajr prayer and made his ablution in silence, and when he stood upon the prayer mat and raised his hands and said Allahu Akbar, the words left his mouth with a weight that was heavier than usual, because they carried within them not just devotion but petition, the desperate unspoken plea of a man who bears responsibility for thousands of lives and knows that a single wrong decision can shatter them all. After the prayer he sat for a long time in the quiet that follows prostration, the quiet that is not empty but full of the presence of the one who listens even when no words are spoken, and he asked for guidance, and the guidance came not as a voice or a vision but as a settling, a certainty, a calm that entered his chest and displaced the turbulence that had lived there since the previous afternoon. He knew what he would do. He summoned Nasa Celebi and Carlil and the Kazi before the morning meal had been served, and they came to his council chamber where the oil lamps were still burning, because the daylight had not yet grown strong enough to penetrate the narrow windows, and they stood before him and waited. The Sultan said, "I have considered the matter, I have prayed upon it, and my decision is this. Carlil's proposal is sound and just. From every household where 2 or more able-bodied men reside, 1 shall be called to serve in the fortification of our borders. The period of service shall be limited. No man shall be kept from his livelihood for longer than is necessary. And those who serve shall be compensated from the treasury, not at the full rate of a hired labourer, for this is a duty shared by the community, but enough that their families do not suffer in their absence." He paused and looked at the Kazi. "Kazi Effendi," he said, "does this satisfy the requirements of the law?" The Kazi was silent for a moment, and in his silence was the careful weighing of a man who understands that his answer will be recorded not only in the annals of this court, but in the ledger that is kept by hands that no mortal can see. And then he said, "If the service is limited, if the households are not left destitute, and if compensation is provided, then I find no objection. It is permissible." Orhan Sahib nodded and said, "Then let it be done. Nasa Celebi, you will oversee the implementation. Carlil, you will ensure that the process is conducted fairly, that no household is burdened beyond what it can bear, and that any disputes are brought before me directly." Both men placed their hands upon their chests and bowed, and said, "As you command, my Sultan." And the matter was settled. But matters that are settled in the council chamber must still be carried out upon the ground, and the ground, as every commander knows, has a way of complicating even the simplest of orders. The villages would need to be visited, the households would need to be counted, the men would need to be selected, some would come willingly, others would resist. And in their resistance would be embedded 1,000 small grievances, old resentments, unanswered injuries, the accumulated frictions of life under any rule, however just. This was the work that lay ahead. This was the unglamorous, essential, exhausting work of governance, the work that no poet celebrates and no singer commemorates, the work that is done in dust and sweat and frustration by men whose names are never remembered and whose labours are never praised. But without this work, the walls would crumble, the borders would fall, the enemies would pour through the gaps like water through a broken dam, and everything that had been built, every mosque and every market and every home and every field, would be swept away. Orhan Sahib understood this. He had always understood this. The sword wins the victory, but it is the shovel and the stone and the mortar that hold it. And so the orders went out, and the messengers rode, and the machinery of the state began to turn. Meanwhile, in the quieter corridors of the palace, the other negotiations of life continued to unfold with their own momentum and their own urgency. Evranosh had spent the night in prayer as well, though his prayers were of a different character than the Sultan's. Where Orhan Sahib had prayed for wisdom in governance, Evranosh had prayed for courage, a different kind of courage, not the courage to face a charging enemy, which he already possessed in abundance, but the courage to stand before the family of the woman he loved and ask for what he wanted most in the world, and accept whatever answer they gave him. He had also, somewhere in the long watches of the night, begun to consider the problem of gold. Fatima Khatun's weight in gold. He turned the figures over in his mind. He did not know exactly what Fatima weighed, had never thought to ask and certainly never would, but he could estimate, and the estimate was devastating. The number was so large that it existed in a realm of mathematics that his soldier's income could not reach, not in a year, not in 5 years, not in a lifetime of saved wages and careful accounting. And yet he had not survived the journey from his old life to this one, had not crossed the vast spiritual distance between the faith of his fathers and the faith he had chosen, had not earned the trust of a sultan and the love of a warrior woman, only to be defeated by arithmetic. There had to be a way. And as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds and poured into the corridors of Bursa like liquid gold, Evranosh stood in his chamber and made a decision. He would go to Alidin Saheb. He would not send an intermediary. He would not wait for a more convenient time. He would go and he would bring Zarkute and Nasa Celebi, and he would present himself honestly, without pretense, without exaggeration, without the kind of false humility that is really just pride wearing a costume, and he would say, "I am a soldier. I am a servant of this dynasty. I love your sister. I have nothing to offer but my sword, my faith, and my life. If these are sufficient, then give her to me. If they are not, then tell me what I must do, and I will do it, even if it takes me the rest of my days." This was his plan. Whether it would work, he did not know. Whether Alidin Sahib would be moved by sincerity or would simply raise an eyebrow and name a number that would take a lifetime to pay, he could not predict. But he would go, he would face it. Because the alternative, to sit in this room and count the gold he did not have and watch the woman he loved marry someone else, this was not an alternative at all. This was surrender, and Evranosh did not know how to surrender. Not anymore. Not ever again. And far away, across the waters that separated the lands of the Ghazi from the ancient heart of Christendom, a ship was being prepared. Andreas had worked through the night. He had called in favors owed by merchants and captains and dockworkers, and every man who had ever needed something from him, and received it. The ship was not large, but it was seaworthy, and it had been provisioned for a journey to Constantinople with enough food and water for the crossing, and enough weapons hidden beneath the deck planks, to ensure that anyone who attempted to board uninvited would regret the decision in the few seconds of life that remained to them afterward. Daphne had not risen from her pallet, but she had not needed to. Her instructions had been delivered from her bed, with the calm authority of a woman who had already mapped every step of the journey in her mind and needed only the physical world to catch up with her planning. She would go to Constantinople. She would present herself at the court of the emperor. She would carry with her information that was more valuable than gold, information about the movements and intentions and vulnerabilities of the Ghazi forces, information that had been obtained at a cost measured not in coins, but in blood and broken bones, and the shattering of trust that can never be fully repaired. But this was not betrayal, not to Daphne. To Daphne this was justice. The people who had tried to kill her, the people who had left her for dead, they belonged to a world that she had once tried to enter and that had rejected her in the most violent and absolute way possible. She owed them nothing. She owed them less than nothing. She owed them exactly what they had given her, pain and darkness, and the cold certainty that mercy was a luxury that neither side could afford. And so the ship would sail, and Daphne would arrive in Constantinople, and the information she carried would be placed before men who understood its value and would use it to shape the course of events that were already in motion, events that would reach back across the water and touch the walls of Bursa and the borders of the Sultanate and the lives of every person whose name has been spoken in this account. Because everything is connected, every thread pulls upon every other thread. The marriage proposal that Evranosh prepares to make is connected to the fortresses that Nasser Celebi is rebuilding, which are connected to the borders that those fortresses protect, which are connected to the enemies who press against those borders, which are connected to the intelligence that Daphne carries, which is connected to the court of Constantinople, which is connected to the ambitions of emperors and the fears of generals, and the prayers of ordinary people who want nothing more than to live their lives in peace, and are given no choice but to endure the consequences of decisions made by men and women they will never meet. This is the way of the world. This has always been the way of the world. And in the fortress of Bursa, as the sun climbed higher and the day asserted itself with the full authority of light and heat, and the relentless forward motion of time, Sultan Orhan Ghazi Hazrat stood at the window of his council chamber and looked out at the city that was his responsibility and his burden and his pride, and he thought about walls. Not just the walls of fortresses, though these were on his mind, but the walls that men build around their hearts, the walls that women build around their pain, the walls that nations build around their fears, the walls that separate what is from what ought to be. Some walls protect, some walls imprison. Some walls do both at the same time, and the wisdom lies in knowing which walls to strengthen and which walls to tear down. He did not have all the answers. No ruler does, but he had faith and he had counsel, and he had the willingness to stand in the gap between the known and the unknown, and make decisions that he could not be certain were right but that he believed, with every fiber of his being, were just. And this, in the end, is all that any leader can offer. Not perfection, not omniscience, not the guarantee that every choice will lead to triumph, but the commitment to seek justice, to protect the weak, to defend the faith, and to carry the weight of responsibility without letting it crush the humanity beneath it. The day moved on. The fortresses would be repaired, the proposals would be made, the ships would sail, the enemies would advance, the prayers would be offered. And the story, this vast and interconnected story of love and war and faith and betrayal and justice and power, would continue to unfold page by page, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, until the final chapter was written by hands that no mortal can control. But that chapter was not yet. Not yet. The sun had not yet set on Bursa, the walls had not yet fallen, the gold had not yet been counted, the ship had not yet reached Constantinople, the prayer had not yet been answered. Everything was still in motion, everything was still possible, everything hung in the balance, trembling, waiting, alive with the terrible and beautiful uncertainty that is the only honest condition of human existence. And somewhere in the depths of the fortress, in a room that smelled of cedar and prayer oil and the ancient stone that had witnessed centuries of human striving, Evranosh knelt upon his prayer mat and whispered into the silence, Ya Allah, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim, guide me through this. I have nothing but my faith and my love and my sword. If these are enough, then open the doors that stand before me, and if they are not enough, then make them enough. Make me enough. I ask this not for myself alone, but for her, for Fatima, who deserves a man who will never stop fighting for her, who will never stop returning to the door that has been closed in his face, who will never stop believing that the impossible is possible, because you are the one who makes all things possible. And the silence held him, and the prayer rose, and the day continued. And the war was not over. The war is never over. It moves, it breathes. It waits in the shadows of every truce and hides behind every smile of peace. It lives in the space between what men say and what they mean, in the distance between what they promise and what they deliver, in the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And those who understand this, those who carry this knowledge in their bones and in their blood, they do not despair. They do not surrender. They do not pretend that the danger has passed. They stand, they pray, they sharpen their swords, and they wait for the dawn, because the dawn always comes, and with it comes the next battle, the next decision, the next moment when everything hangs in the balance and a single choice can change the course of history. This is the story of Orhan Sahib. This is the story of Evranosh and Fatima and Zarkute and Nasa Celebi and Carlil and Daphne and Andreas, and every soul who walks through this account carrying their burdens and their hopes and their fears. This is their story. And it is not finished. Assalamu alaikum, Nazreen. The days that followed moved like water through stone, slow and patient, and carving channels that would not be visible until long after the carving was done. The fortress of Bursa breathed with the rhythm of preparation, of waiting, of the particular tension that settles upon a place when its inhabitants know that something is coming, but cannot yet see its shape upon the horizon. Orhan Sahib had given his orders, the messengers had ridden, and now the machinery of implementation ground forward with the relentless patience of a millstone, crushing the grain of intention into the flour of action, one rotation at a time. In the villages that dotted the countryside like scattered seeds upon tilled earth, the Sultan's decree arrived with the weight of law and the softening cloth of mercy wrapped around it. One man from every household where 2 or more able-bodied men resided, limited service, compensation from the treasury, the fortresses must be strengthened, the borders must be secured. This is your duty. This is your honor. This is the price of the peace you enjoy. Some villages received the news with resignation. They had seen decrees before. They had sent their sons and brothers to labor on walls and roads and bridges, and most of those sons and brothers had returned, and the walls and roads and bridges had stood, and the enemies had been kept at bay for another season. This was the rhythm of life under any rule worth living under. Protection required participation. Security demanded sacrifice. A man who wished to enjoy the shade of a tree he did not plant was a man who did not understand how trees grew. Other villages received the news with murmuring, with sideways glances, with the quiet calculations of men who had learned to count the cost of everything, and found that the cost was always higher than the counting could capture. They would comply because the alternative was worse, but they would remember, and their remembering would become part of the soil from which future grievances would grow, seasons hence, years hence, in times that no one present could foresee. And in a few villages, scattered along the edges of the territory where the Sultan's authority was newest and most lightly held, the news was received with something closer to defiance. These were villages that had changed hands more than once in living memory, villages whose elders could remember when the banners that flew above them bore different symbols, and the language spoken in the courts was different, and the gods invoked in the temples were called by other names. For these villages, every decree from Bursa was a reminder that they were ruled by men who had come from elsewhere, and every labor extracted from them was a tax paid to conquerors, however just those conquerors might be. Nasa Celebi understood this. He had been given the task of implementation, and he approached it not with the blunt instrument of command, but with the finer tools of persuasion and presence. He rode from village to village himself, not sending subordinates but appearing in person, dismounting from his horse in the central square, sitting with the elders, drinking their bitter coffee, listening to their complaints before he explained the necessity, answering their questions with patience even when the questions were asked with hostility. He told them stories. He told them about sieges he had witnessed where the walls held and the people inside survived. He told them about sieges where the walls crumbled and the people inside did not survive. He told them that the difference between those two outcomes was often no more than a few feet of reinforced stone, a gate that swung true on its hinges, a watchtower that could see the enemy coming while there was still time to prepare. "You are not building these walls for the Sultan," he said. "You are building them for your children. You are building them for your wives. You are building them so that when the enemy comes, and the enemy always comes, there will be something standing between them and everything you love." Some were convinced, some were merely compliant, some remained unconvinced but lacked the courage or the organization to resist. And slowly, man by man, village by village, the labor force assembled and the work began. The sound of hammers rang out from the border fortresses, the sound of stone being shaped and lifted and fitted into place, the sound of mortar being mixed and applied, the sound of men working in the heat and the dust, their backs bent, their hands rough, their faces grim with effort and resignation, and in some cases, the reluctant pride that comes from building something that will outlast the builders. Orhan Sahib received reports. He studied them in his council chamber, comparing the progress at each site, identifying the bottlenecks, allocating additional resources where they were needed. He was not a man who ruled from a distance. He understood that a sultan who does not know the details of his domain is a sultan who will be surprised by those details at the moment when surprise is most dangerous. And yet, even as he attended to the work of fortification, his mind turned also to the other matters that pressed upon him, matters that could not be addressed with stone and mortar, matters that required the subtler arts of diplomacy and patience and the reading of hearts. The matter of Evranosh and Fatima had reached his ears. It could not have failed to reach his ears. In a court as intimate as Bursa, where the walls themselves seemed to listen, and the servants carried whispers like bees carrying pollen, no secret of the heart remained secret for long. He had watched Evranosh from a distance over the past days, observed the particular quality of distraction that had settled upon his most trusted commander, noticed the way Evranosh's gaze followed Fatima when she crossed a courtyard or entered a room, noticed the way Fatima's gaze followed Evranosh in return when she thought no one was watching. These were good people, loyal people, people who had earned whatever happiness they could find in a world that offered happiness so sparingly. And yet the matter was not simple. Nothing in a royal household was ever simple. Fatima was his sister. Her marriage was a matter of state as well as a matter of heart. The man she wed would become connected to the ruling family by bonds that carried political weight, and that weight had to be considered, had to be measured, had to be placed upon the scales alongside love and longing, and all the other insubstantial things that poets celebrated and rulers had to translate into practical arrangements. Evranosh was a convert. This was not an obstacle in itself. The faith welcomed converts, honored them, recognized that the soul that chooses to enter is sometimes stronger than the soul that was born within. But Evranosh had no family, no tribe, no network of alliances and obligations that stretched back generations and could be called upon in times of need. He brought only himself, his sword, his loyalty, his faith. Was this enough? Orhan Sahib believed it was. He believed that character was worth more than lineage, that devotion was worth more than dowry, that a man who had crossed the great divide between worlds and emerged with his honor intact was a man who could be trusted with anything, including the happiness of a sister. But he was not the only voice that would speak in this matter. Malhan Khatun would speak, Alidin Sahib would speak, and the weight of tradition would speak, that silent, invisible, immensely powerful voice that whispered in every ear and reminded everyone that things had always been done a certain way, and that departing from that way was a risk, a gamble, an invitation to consequences that could not be foreseen. The Sultan resolved to wait. He would not intervene prematurely. He would let the process unfold as it was meant to unfold, let Evranosh present his case, let the family deliberate, let the negotiations proceed through their customary stages. And when the moment came for his voice to be heard, he would speak clearly and firmly in favor of the match. But that moment had not yet come, and until it came, he would watch and wait and pray that the hearts of all involved would find their way to the same destination. Meanwhile, far from the concerns of courtship and custom, in the dense and shadowed forests that lay between the territories of men who prayed toward Mecca and men who prayed toward altars adorned with icons and incense, other movements were taking place. Andreas had completed his preparations. The ship lay at anchor in a hidden cove, its sails furled, its crew alert, its hold stocked with everything necessary for the journey to Constantinople and everything necessary to ensure that the journey would not be interrupted by pirates or patrols or any of the other hazards that waited upon the waters between here and there. He had returned to the small stone house in the forest where Daphne lay recovering, and he had found her sitting up, which she had not been able to do when he left, her back propped against the wall, her eyes clear with a clarity that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with will. "The ship is ready," he said. Daphne nodded slowly. She did not waste words on gratitude. Gratitude was for people who had received gifts they did not expect. She had expected Andreas to succeed because she had chosen him precisely for his ability to succeed, and her expectations had been met, and that was all. "When do we sail?" she said. "Tomorrow night. The tide will be favorable. The moon will be new. We will slip out of the cove in darkness and be well out to sea before dawn. By the time anyone realizes you have left, we will be beyond pursuit." Daphne considered this and said, "The crew. Do they know who I am? Do they know what I carry?" Andreas shook his head. "They know only that they are being paid well to transport a passenger of importance. They do not ask questions because they have been paid not to ask questions. And if any of them were to become curious, they would find their curiosity discouraged by the men I have placed among them, men whose loyalty to me is beyond question, and whose willingness to enforce silence is beyond doubt." "Good," Daphne said, and then she was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet her eyes moved to the single small window through which the afternoon light was filtering, and she said, "When I reach Constantinople, I will need an audience with the emperor himself. Not a minister, not a secretary, not a functionary who will hear my information and decide whether it is worth passing upward. The emperor himself. Can this be arranged?" Andreas hesitated. He was a capable man, a resourceful man, a man with connections that reached into many rooms and many levels of power. But the emperor of Constantinople was not simply another connection. The emperor was the center of a web that stretched across continents, the inheritor of 1,000 years of Roman authority, the sovereign whose word was law and whose attention was guarded by layers upon layers of ceremony and protocol, and the jealous gatekeeping of courtiers who derived their power from controlling access to his presence. "I know people who know people," Andreas said carefully. "I can get you through the outer doors. I can get you into rooms where the people who advise the emperor take meetings. But the emperor himself, that will require more than connections. That will require something to offer, something so valuable that the gatekeepers cannot afford to keep it from him." Daphne's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile, but contained within it the shadow of one. "What I carry," she said, "is exactly that. The gatekeepers will recognize it. And if they do not recognize it immediately, they will recognize it when I explain what it means and what it will cost them if they fail to act upon it." Andreas looked at her, and in his looking was a question he had not yet asked. A question that had been forming in his mind since the night he first received word that she was alive. The question of what exactly had happened to her, what exactly she had learned, what exactly she was carrying that could justify this journey and this risk and this gamble upon the attention of an emperor. Daphne saw the question in his eyes and said, "You want to know what I know?" Andreas said, "I want to know whatever you are willing to tell me." Daphne considered him for a long moment, weighing him, measuring him against standards that only she could see, and then she said, "The Ghazis are preparing to move. Not a raid, not a skirmish, a campaign. Orhan Sahib has spent the past months consolidating his hold on the territories he already controls, repairing the fortresses, strengthening the borders, building the infrastructure that will allow him to supply a sustained military effort far from his capital. He is not doing this to defend what he has, he is doing this to take more." Andreas absorbed this and said, "This is not unknown. Everyone expects the Ghazis to expand. They have been expanding for a generation." Daphne's eyes sharpened. "Yes," she said, "but no one knows where. No one knows when. No one knows the route of the advance or the size of the force or the identity of the commanders who will lead each wing of the attack. I know these things. I know them because I was in places where these things were discussed, and I listened, and I remembered, and I survived long enough to carry what I heard out of those places and into this room." Andreas was silent for a moment, and then he said, "How did you come to be in those places?" Daphne's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, hardened, became a wall that he could not see past. "That," she said, "is not a story I will tell. Not to you, not to the emperor, not to anyone. What matters is that I was there and I heard and I know. The rest is mine." Andreas accepted this because he had no choice but to accept it, and because he understood, in the way that men who have lived long enough to accumulate their own collection of untellable stories understand, that some knowledge is purchased at prices that cannot be spoken aloud without diminishing both the speaker and the listener. "Very well," he said, "we sail tomorrow night. Rest, gather your strength. The journey will not be easy, and what awaits at the end of it will be harder still." Daphne closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the wall and said, "I have strength enough for what needs to be done. I have had nothing else to feed on for weeks but the thought of what needs to be done. It has sustained me better than any food, better than any medicine, better than any comfort. The thought of seeing their faces when they realize that the woman they left for dead has risen and come for them with the power of an empire at her back, this thought has kept my heart beating when my heart wanted to stop." She opened her eyes again and looked at Andreas, and in her gaze was something that he recognized because he had seen it before in the eyes of soldiers who had survived what should have killed them and were no longer quite the same people they had been before. Something that was not madness but was adjacent to it, something that burned with a flame that was steady and cold and would not be extinguished until it had consumed everything it touched. "They tried to kill me," she said. "They failed. Now it is my turn." And Andreas said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and the afternoon light continued to filter through the window, and somewhere outside a bird called once and then fell silent, and the forest held its breath around the small stone house where vengeance lay recovering and preparing for its journey across the sea. And back in Bursa, the day continued to turn. Evranosh had made his decision. He had prayed, and the prayer had settled him, and the fear that had been buzzing in his chest like a trapped insect had quieted into something that was not quite confidence, but was at least determination, which was close enough for a man who understood that confidence was often just determination wearing finer clothes. He found Zarkute in the courtyard near the stables, engaged in a conversation with one of the horse handlers about the condition of a mare who had been favoring her left foreleg for several days. Zarkute was examining the leg with the practiced eye of a man who had spent more years in the company of horses than in the company of men and who trusted horses considerably more than he trusted most men, though he would never have said so aloud. Evranosh waited until the examination was complete and the handler had led the mare away, and then he approached and said, "Zarkute Saheb, I am ready." Zarkute straightened and turned and looked at Evranosh, and in his looking was an assessment that took in everything: the set of the shoulders, the steadiness of the gaze, the way the hands were held, all the small signs by which a man reveals whether he is prepared for what lies ahead or merely pretending to be prepared. "Ready for what?" Zarkute said, though he knew the answer. Evranosh said, "I am ready to go to Alidin Saheb. I am ready to ask for Fatima Khatun's hand. I have no gold, I have no family, I have no lineage to recite or tribe to invoke, but I have my sword and I have my faith and I have my love for her. If these are not enough, then I will learn what else is required and I will obtain it, even if it takes me the rest of my life. But I will not wait any longer. I cannot wait any longer. The waiting itself is destroying me." Zarkute was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You understand that the first answer will likely be no." "I understand." "You understand that the second answer may also be no." "I understand." "You understand that Alidin Saheb is a man of, how shall I say this, particular disposition when it comes to matters involving the exchange of value, and that he will view this negotiation as exactly that, a negotiation to be conducted with the same rigor and skepticism that he brings to every transaction, whether it involves the price of grain or the fate of his sister's heart." "I understand," Evranosh said, and his voice was steady, because he had already considered all of this in the long watches of the night, and had decided that understanding the obstacles was not the same as being deterred by them. Zarkute smiled then, a small smile, the kind that older men give to younger men when they recognize something in them that they remember from their own youth, something reckless and essential, and worth protecting even when it leads to failure. "Good," Zarkute said, "then let us find Nasa Celebi and let us go. The day is not getting any younger, and neither are we, and if we are going to be refused, I would prefer to be refused before the afternoon prayer, so that I can spend the evening telling you I told you so while we plan our second attempt." Evranosh's face broke into something that was almost a laugh, and he said, "Thank you, Zarkute Saheb. I do not know what I would do without you." "You would make a fool of yourself," Zarkute said, "which you are going to do anyway, but at least with me present you will make a fool of yourself with a witness who can later correct the more embarrassing details of the story when it is told and retold around fires for generations to come." And they went to find Nasa Celebi. They found him in the administrative quarters, reviewing a stack of reports from the construction sites with the harried expression of a man who was discovering that managing labor was considerably more complicated than commanding soldiers. Soldiers followed orders because they had been trained to follow orders. Laborers followed orders when the orders made sense to them, and when they did not, they found creative ways to misunderstand or delay or simply disappear into the vast anonymity of a workforce that was too large to supervise man by man. "Nasa," Zarkute said, "put down the papers. We have a mission." Nasa Celebi looked up, and when he saw Evranosh standing behind Zarkute, he understood immediately what mission was being proposed, and his expression shifted from harassment to interest to something that might have been described as anticipatory amusement. "Now," he said. "Now," Zarkute confirmed. Nasa Celebi set down the papers, stood, adjusted his robes, and said, "Then let us not keep Alidin Saheb waiting. He is a man who values punctuality, even when the visitors have not been announced." And the three of them walked through the corridors of Bursa, through the courtyards where servants moved on their endless errands and guards stood at their posts, and women hurried past with covered trays, and the thousand small activities of daily life continued without interruption. And they climbed the stairs to the wing of the palace where Alidin Saheb maintained his quarters and conducted his business, which was, depending on the day, the business of the state or the business of his own extensive interests, which were intertwined with the business of the state in ways that made separation difficult and perhaps unnecessary. They reached the door. A servant stood beside it, young and alert, trained to intercept visitors before they could interrupt the master's work. Zarkute said, "Inform Alidin Saheb that we request an audience. The matter is personal but urgent." The servant looked at the three of them, assessing their rank and their likely purpose, and then slipped through the door. A moment passed. The door opened again. "He will say you," the servant said. And they entered. The room was not large, but it was filled with the accumulated evidence of a life devoted to commerce and calculation. Maps hung on the walls, marked with trade routes and ports and the locations of resources that could be bought and sold. Ledgers were stacked on tables, their spines cracked from use, their pages dense with figures. An abacus sat within arm's reach of the chair where Alidin Saheb was seated, a tool that he was known to use with a speed and precision that left observers slightly unnerved, as though they were watching something that should have been beyond human capacity. Alidin Saheb looked up as they entered. He was a man of middle years, neither tall nor short, neither thin nor heavy, with a face that revealed nothing and eyes that revealed everything, if you knew how to read them. Those eyes were reading the three visitors now, calculating their purpose before they spoke, estimating the likely nature of their request based on who they were and who was missing, and what combinations of presence and absence produced what kinds of conversations. "Zarkute," he said, "Nasa Celebi, Evranosh, this is an unusual delegation. What brings you to my door in the middle of the day without appointment or announcement?" Zarkute took a breath, because someone had to speak first and he was the eldest present, and he said, "Alidin Saheb, we come on a matter of the heart." Alidin Saheb's eyebrows rose fractionally. "A matter of the heart," he repeated. "This is not typically the category of matter that brings armed men to my chambers. Usually those matters are left to mothers and aunties and professional matchmakers. Is one of you secretly a professional matchmaker? I confess I had not suspected it." Zarkute refused to be deterred by the tone, which was dry but not hostile, and he continued, "Evranosh, who stands before you, has asked us to accompany him because he wishes to speak to you about your sister." Now both of Alidin Saheb's eyebrows rose, and he turned his attention fully to Evranosh, who stood very straight and met his gaze without flinching, though the effort to do so was visible in the tension of his jaw and the careful stillness of his hands. "Evranosh," Alidin Saheb said, "you wish to marry Fatima." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of a man who had understood the purpose of this visit before the visitors had climbed the first stair. Evranosh said yes. Alidin Saheb leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together and regarded Evranosh with an expression that gave away nothing, that could have meant anything. That was precisely the kind of expression that a lifetime of negotiation had trained him to produce on demand. "Tell me," he said, "why you believe you are worthy of her." And here was the moment. Here was the test. Here was the opportunity to recite lineages that did not exist, to invoke alliances that were not there, to offer wealth that he did not possess, or to do what Evranosh had decided in the watches of the night he would do, which was to tell the truth and let the truth stand or fall on its own merits. "I do not believe I am worthy of her," Evranosh said. "No man is worthy of her. She is a leader of warriors, a daughter of this noble house, a woman whose courage and faith and capability exceed anything I could claim to match. I am not worthy of her, but I love her. I love her with everything I am. I have loved her from the moment I first understood what love was, and I will love her until the moment I draw my last breath, and if the gates of paradise open to me after that breath, I will love her there as well. This is not a negotiation to me. This is not a transaction. This is the only truth I know how to speak, and I speak it now before you, and I ask you to consider whether a man who loves this completely, and this honestly, is not perhaps worth more than a man who comes with gold and lineages and alliances, but whose heart is less certain." The room was silent. Zarkute and Nasa Celebi stood very still, uncertain whether they had just witnessed the most effective appeal in the history of marriage proposals or the most catastrophic miscalculation. Alidin Saheb's expression did not change. His eyes did not leave Evranosh's face, and for a long moment nothing happened, nothing moved, nothing was said. Then Alidin Saheb unfolded his hands and placed them flat upon the table before him and said, You are correct that you are not worthy of her. No man is. I was not worthy of my own wife when I married her, and I have spent every day since trying to become worthy, and I have not yet succeeded, and I suspect I never will. This is the nature of marriage between people who actually mean something to each other. The unworthiness is not the obstacle. The unworthiness is the beginning. He paused, but he continued, and the word landed with the weight of a boulder dropped into still water. There is also the matter of practical arrangements. Fatima is the daughter of Osman Ghazi, the granddaughter of Ertugrul. Her ma must reflect her status. Her wedding must reflect her honor. These are not vanities. These are requirements that the world imposes upon us whether we like them or not. If you marry her with nothing, the world will say that she was sold cheaply, that her family did not value her, that the house of Osman has fallen so far that it gives away its daughters to penniless soldiers. This cannot be allowed, not because I care what the world says, but because Fatima will live in the world and the world's words will follow her, and I will not let my sister carry the burden of whispers for the rest of her life. Evranosh listened, and his heart, which had risen during the first part of Alidin Saheb's speech, steadied itself for the descent that seemed to be coming. "What do you require?" he said. Alidin Saheb named a figure. The figure was not Fatima's weight in gold. It was not an impossible sum designed to make Evranosh abandon hope and walk away. It was a real number, substantial but not astronomical, the kind of number that a man could reach if he worked and saved, and was favored by fortune and Allah. But it was also a number that Evranosh did not currently possess, not even close. "I do not have this," Evranosh said, and his voice was steady because he had already known that this was coming, "but I will earn it. I will take whatever assignments the Sultan gives me. I will ride wherever I am sent. I will fight whatever enemies need fighting. And I will set aside every dinar that I earn until I have what you require. If this takes a year, I will wait a year. If it takes 5 years, I will wait 5 years. But I will not walk away. I will not give up. And I will return to this room with the full amount, and I will lay it before you, and I will ask again." Alidin Saheb looked at him, and something in his expression shifted, softened almost imperceptibly, as though a door that had been locked was now slightly ajar. "You would wait 5 years," he said. "I would wait 10, Evranosh said. "I would wait 20. Time is not the obstacle. Fatima is the only woman I will ever marry. If I cannot marry her this year, I will marry her another year. And if I cannot marry her in this life, then I will pray that Allah grants us both entry to paradise so that I can marry her there." The room was silent again. Zarkute and Nasser Celebi had the expressions of men watching something unfold that they did not fully understand, but that they sensed was significant. Alidin Saheb stood from his chair. He walked around the table. He stopped in front of Evranosh and looked him directly in the eyes, and the distance between them was so small that Evranosh could see the fine lines at the corners of Alidin's eyes, the evidence of years of reading in poor light, the human details that the negotiating mask usually concealed. "I am not going to make you wait 20 years, Alidin Saheb said. "I am not going to make you wait 5 years. I am going to make you wait until the Mar is assembled, and you are going to assemble it not alone but with the help of everyone in this room who calls you brother. And while you are assembling it, you are going to prove to everyone, not just to me but to the world that will whisper that you deserve her. Not by words, by deeds, by service. By the kind of actions that make men say, that man is worthy, not because he was born worthy, but because he made himself worthy." He stepped back. "That is my answer," he said. "It is not no. It is not yet. Now leave my chambers. I have work to do and you have ma to earn." Evranosh bowed and Zarkute bowed, and Nasser Celebi bowed, and they left the room in silence, and they did not speak until they had descended the stairs and passed through the courtyard and reached a quiet corner of the palace where no one else could hear. Then Zarkute laughed, a great booming laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, and he clapped Evranosh on the shoulder and said, "You magnificent fool, you actually did it. You walked into the den of the most calculating man in the Sultanate and you spoke to him about love and unworthiness and paradise, and he did not throw you out. He gave you a path. This is more than anyone expected. This is more than I would have believed possible." Nasser Celebi was grinning as well. "The ma he named," he said, "it is not nothing, but it is not impossible either. Between your wages and whatever we can add and whatever opportunities arise, we can reach that number. Not quickly perhaps, but we can reach it. You will marry her, Evranosh. The how has been established. Now we just need to work on the when." Evranosh stood very still, and his eyes were wet, though no tears fell, and he said, "I do not know how to thank you. Either of you. You stood with me. You came into that room with me. I could not have done this alone." Zarkute's expression softened. "That is what brothers do," he said, "whether they share blood or not. Now come, let us pray. Let us thank Allah for this beginning and ask him for strength to reach the end." And the three of them went to pray. And the afternoon sun continued its slow arc across the sky above Bursa, and the shadows lengthened, and somewhere in the women's quarters of the palace, Fatima Khatun sat with her embroidery in her lap and her mind somewhere else entirely, wondering what was happening in her brother's chambers, wondering whether Evrinosh had spoken, wondering whether the answer had been given, wondering whether her future was being decided at this very moment by men in a room she could not enter. And she did not know yet. She would not know for hours, until the evening when Evrinosh would find a way to send word to her, a brief message delivered by a trusted intermediary, just 2 words that contained everything. He said yes. Not yet technically, not a complete and immediate yes, but yes enough, yes with conditions, yes with a path, yes that meant there was hope, that there was a future, that the door that had seemed so heavy and so firmly closed was now open just a crack, and that crack let in a light that Fatima could feel even before she saw it, a warmth that spread through her chest and made her hands tremble as they held the message. He said yes. And she whispered, Alhamdulillah, and the word carried all the weight and all the joy and all the fear and all the hope that had been building inside her for months, and she closed her eyes and let the tears fall, because some tears are not grief but gratitude, and these were tears of gratitude, and they were holy. And the day moved on. And in other parts of the world, other movements continued. The ship that carried Daphne slipped out of the hidden cove as the moon set behind the mountains and left the sky dark and star-scattered. The oars dipped silently into the black water and pulled, and the hull cut through the gentle swells with a whisper, and by the time the first grey light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, the shore was a memory and the open sea stretched in every direction like a promise or a threat, depending on what you expected to find on the other side. Daphne lay below decks, her wounds bandaged, her body still weak but her mind sharp, sharper perhaps than it had ever been, because suffering has a way of burning away everything unnecessary and leaving only the essential, the core, the irreducible self that remains when everything else has been stripped away. She thought about Constantinople. She thought about the emperor's court, the intrigues and the jealousies and the constant maneuvering for position and favor. She thought about the men she would need to convince, the skeptics and the doubters, and the enemies of her enemies who might become her allies if she could show them that her cause and their cause pointed in the same direction. She thought about revenge. Not the hot, impulsive revenge of passion. That would have been easier, would have felt better in the short term, would have offered the immediate satisfaction of striking back at those who had struck her. But hot revenge was wasteful. Hot revenge exhausted itself in a single blow and left nothing behind but emptiness and the realization that the pain remained even after the pain had been repaid. No, Daphne's revenge was cold. It was patient. It was architectural, designed not to strike a single blow but to dismantle a structure, to weaken foundations, to arrange circumstances so that her enemies destroyed themselves through their own actions, so that when they fell they would fall not because she had pushed them, but because the ground beneath their feet had been carefully, quietly, systematically removed. This required time. This required resources. This required the attention of powerful people who had reasons of their own to want what she wanted. And she would obtain all of these things. She would obtain them in Constantinople, or she would die trying, and at this point, dying held no particular terror for her, because she had already been so close to death that she could describe its face in detail, and the face had not been frightening, only tired, only patient, only waiting. The ship sailed on, the days passed. The sea stretched out before them, endless and indifferent, and Daphne watched the horizon and waited for the first glimpse of the city that had stood for 1,000 years, the city that had seen empires rise and fall, the city that would now become the instrument of her purpose. And back in the territories of the Ghazi, the work continued. The fortresses rose stone by stone, the walls were reinforced, the gates were strengthened, the watchtowers were rebuilt with better sightlines and sturdier foundations. The men labored in the sun and the dust, and some of them cursed under their breath, and some of them prayed as they worked, and all of them understood in some deep and wordless way that what they were building was not just walls but the future, the shape of things to come, the boundary between what was and what would be. Nasser Celebi rode from site to site, inspecting progress, resolving disputes, ensuring that the supplies kept flowing and the workers were fed and the local commanders understood what was expected of them. He had not anticipated that this would be his role, had imagined himself always in the vanguard, always riding toward the enemy, always at the sharp edge where glory was won and names were made. But he had come to understand, as every man who serves long enough comes to understand, that the sharp edge is only possible because of everything behind it, the supply lines and the administration, and the unglamorous labor of building and maintaining and preparing. He did not resent this understanding, he accepted it, and in accepting it he found a different kind of satisfaction, not the immediate thrill of combat but the slower, deeper satisfaction of watching something take shape under his guidance, of knowing that when the walls were finished and the gates were hung and the watchtowers were manned, he would be able to point to them and say, I helped build this, I was part of this exists because of what I did. And this too was service, this too was jihad, this too was worthy. The days became weeks, the weeks moved toward a month, the fortresses neared completion. And in Bursa, Orhan Sahib watched the reports come in and nodded his approval and turned his attention to the next phase, the phase that would come after the building, the phase that would justify all the building, the phase that everyone was waiting for but that no one would speak of aloud until the Sultan himself spoke of it. The advance, the expansion, the next campaign. It was coming, everyone knew it was coming. The preparations were too extensive, the fortifications too thorough, the stockpiling of supplies too deliberate to mean anything else. Orhan Sahib was building not just walls but a launch platform, a secure base from which to project power in directions that had not yet been announced, but that could be calculated by anyone who understood geography and strategy and the eternal pressure of ambition against opportunity. The question was not whether the campaign would come, the question was where and when, and whether the enemies who waited in that direction would be ready. And far away, sailing toward Constantinople on a ship that no one in Bursa knew about, carrying information that no one in Bursa could guess she possessed, Daphne might have answered those questions. She knew the where, she knew the when, she knew the names and the numbers and the routes. And she was going to share this knowledge with the one power that could use it to stop what was coming, or at least to prepare for it, to blunt its edge, to ensure that the advance was not the triumph that Orhan Sahib was planning, but the beginning of a longer, harder, bloodier struggle than anyone anticipated. Because Daphne did not care about empires, she did not care about faiths, she did not care about the grand movements of history or the destinies of peoples. She cared about one thing: making them pay. And the sea stretched out before her, and the ship sailed on, and the fate of nations moved toward its next turning. And in Bursa, Evranosh knelt in prayer as the sun set, and his lips moved silently, and the words were not requests but promises, not pleas but commitments. I will earn what is required, I will prove what must be proven, I will become worthy of her, not because I was born worthy, but because I choose to become worthy. Ya Allah, give me strength, give me patience, give me the endurance to reach the end of this path without faltering, and if I falter, give me the courage to rise again and continue. And the prayer rose, and the night descended, and the world turned toward whatever morning was waiting on the other side of the darkness. And Turhan, standing watch upon the eastern wall of the border fortress that was nearest to completion, looked out at the darkening landscape and thought about the weeks ahead, the orders that would surely come, the commands that would send him and his men out of these walls and into the territories beyond, and he felt the familiar stirring in his blood, the ancient readiness, the warrior's impatience for the waiting to end and the action to begin. Soon, he thought, not yet, but soon. And he was right, it was coming. All of it was coming, rushing toward the present like a river toward a waterfall, unstoppable, inevitable, and the sound of its approaching roar was just beginning to become audible to those who knew how to listen. The war was not over. It was only pausing, gathering its strength, preparing for the next phase. And when it resumed, nothing would be the same. Nothing would be spared. And the only question that mattered, the only question that had ever mattered, was not whether the war would come, but whether those who faced it would be ready. The night deepened over Bursa, the stars emerged, the prayers were spoken, the lovers dreamed of each other across the distance of separate chambers, the planners pored over their maps, the builders rested their aching muscles, the sentries watched the darkness for movement that did not come, not yet, not tonight. But tomorrow was another day. And the war was not over. Assalamu alaikum, travelers of forgotten ages. Sit close now, let the fire burn low, let the shadows do their work, for what follows is not merely a tale of swords and thrones, it is a reckoning of hearts that loved in silence, of hands that reached across chasms of blood and betrayal, and of a kingdom that stood balanced on the edge of a blade so thin that even the wind dared not breathe upon it. The morning had broken over Bursa like a cracked mirror, fragments of pale gold scattered across the rooftops of the palace, across the ancient stones of the courtyard, across the tired faces of soldiers who had not slept. There was a stillness to the air, the kind of stillness that precedes not peace but decision. And it was in this stillness, beside the stable where his warhorse stood breathing heavily from the previous night's patrol, that Evanos found himself standing, his hand upon the mane of the great animal, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the walls. He had been thinking for days now, though he would not admit it to any man who asked. His thoughts were not of war, not of the siege lines that Shahanshah had drawn around the eastern valleys, not of the reports that Turhan had brought back from the mountain passes where Byzantine scouts had been spotted moving in columns of 3 and 4. No, His thoughts were of something far more dangerous than any army. His thoughts were of her. And then, as though summoned by the very fire of his contemplation, she appeared. Fatima Khatun. She walked toward him across the courtyard with that particular stride of hers, unhurried, dignified, the edges of her garment brushing the dust as though even the earth wished to touch her. And she was smiling, that smile. That impossible, radiant, world-undoing smile that made Evanos forget every battle he had ever fought, every wound he had ever earned, every prayer he had ever whispered in the darkest hours of the night. Evanos turned to her and his voice came out quieter than he intended. He said, Fatima Khatun, when you smile like that, it brings me a joy I cannot measure, a joy that surpasses victory on the field, a joy that surpasses the call of the morning prayer echoing over the valley. You carry light in your face, and I am merely a man standing in its path. Fatima stepped closer and her smile deepened and she said, My brother has forgiven me. Evanos, do you understand what I am saying? My brother has forgiven me. The weight that sat upon my shoulders, the burden that pressed against my chest with every breath, it has been lifted. He looked into my eyes and he spoke the words, and it was as though chains I did not even know I was carrying simply fell away and turned to dust. Evanos exhaled, a breath he had been holding for longer than he realized. He whispered, Praise be to Allah, praise be to the most merciful, the most compassionate. This is a blessing beyond what I dared to hope. And he paused, and then he added, with something between hope and terror in his voice, and perhaps soon he will forgive me as well. Fatima tilted her head and looked at him, and the look in her eyes was both tender and knowing. She said, Yes, perhaps he will. A silence passed between them. The horse shifted its weight. Somewhere beyond the walls, a blacksmith's hammer rang against hot iron, a sound like a heartbeat made of steel. Then Evanos spoke again, and this time his voice carried a different note, a note of careful, deliberate intention. He said, Fatima, I have been thinking. Since your duties have lightened, since the burden you carried has been lifted, perhaps now is the time for you to turn your thoughts toward your trousseau, toward preparation, toward the things that must be gathered and arranged before a union can be sanctified. Fatima's smile shifted. It did not disappear, but it changed shape, becoming sharper, becoming the smile of a woman who knows exactly what a man is doing and intends to make him work for every step of it. She said, Look at you, already interfering in my affairs, and we are not even married yet, already deciding what I should think about, what I should prepare. Evanos Saheb, you overstep. Evanos raised both hands as though deflecting a blow. He said, I am not interfering. I would never interfere. I am merely suggesting. I am merely observing that the road ahead has many preparations, and I do not wish for you to be overwhelmed when the time comes. I am thinking of your comfort, Fatima, nothing more. Fatima folded her arms. She said, I am the leader of the Bajian. I carry the weight of their training, their discipline, their readiness for battle. Do not speak to me of being overwhelmed. And besides, I already have a trousseau. Do you not remember? It was prepared long ago. Evanos shook his head slowly. He said, I do not want that one. Fatima's eyes widened. She said, Allah, Allah, so now you will choose even the trousseau. Now you will dictate what is acceptable and what is not. Before you start making such demands, perhaps you should first obtain my brother's approval. Let us see if he even permits this marriage to take place. A cold wind moved through Evanos then, not from the air but from within. He said, do you truly think there is a possibility that he would refuse? Fatima looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I do not know, Evanos. That depends entirely on you, on how you present yourself, on who you bring with you when you come to ask. Evanos frowned. He said, who I bring with me? What do you mean? I would come myself. Is that not enough? Fatima shook her head gently. She said, my brother and my mother, they will test you. They will turn you around and send you back. You will not succeed on your first attempt. You must understand this. Evanos stared at her. He said, first attempt. You say first attempt as though there will be a second, and a third. How many times must I do this? Fatima's voice softened, but there was iron beneath the softness. She said, there was once a man who came 3 times to ask for my hand. 3 times he stood before my family and spoke his case, and 3 times he was turned away. He could not have me. Not everyone can have me, Evanos. You must understand this truth before you begin this journey. Something moved in Evanos's chest, something dark and hot and possessive. He said, who was this man, who came 3 times? Besides Yaqid, who else dared to seek your hand? Fatima waved her hand as though brushing away a fly. She said, it does not matter. You should not concern yourself with such things. Focus on the task before you. Think about who you will bring when you come to ask for my hand. Think about how you will present yourself. These are the things that matter now. But Evanos could not let it go. The fire in his chest would not permit it. He said, Fatima, who wanted to marry you? You said everyone. You said not everyone can have you. How many men have sought your hand? Fatima turned to leave. she said. I cannot keep track of everyone in my mind, Evanos. Evanos stepped forward. He said, everyone, how many is everyone? But Fatima did not answer. She walked away across the courtyard, her footsteps steady, her head held high, and Evanos stood there beside his horse with his mouth open and his heart hammering, and the morning light falling across his face like a verdict he could not appeal. He whispered after her. He said, Fatima, Fatima, you said everyone, how many, Fatima? But she was gone, and the courtyard was empty, and the horse looked at him with an expression that, if horses could speak, would have said, you are in trouble, my friend, deep, irreversible trouble. Now turn your gaze away from the palace, turn it toward the forest, toward the deep, ancient, impenetrable forest where the trees grew so thick that even the noonday sun could not reach the ground, where the earth was soft with centuries of fallen leaves, where the shadows moved not because of the wind but because of something else entirely, something watching, something waiting. It was into this forest that Andreas rode, alone. His horse was lathered and breathing hard, its hooves striking the roots and stones with desperate urgency. Andreas had not slept in 2 days. His eyes were red-rimmed. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face had become visible ridges beneath the skin. He rode as a man rides when the woman he loves is dying, and every heartbeat is a countdown he cannot stop. He reached the small house at the edge of the forest clearing. It was barely a house at all, more of a shelter, 4 walls and a roof built by hands that cared more about speed than craft. A guard stood outside, a man with a short sword and nervous eyes. Andreas dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. He hit the ground running. He looked at the guard and said, where is she? The guard pointed inward. He said, inside, my lord. She lives, but barely. Andreas pushed past him. He said, leave us alone. Whatever you hear, do not enter. The guard retreated into the trees. Andreas stepped through the doorway into the dim interior, and his eyes took a moment to adjust to the darkness, and then he saw her. Daphne. She lay on a rough bed of straw and cloth, her face pale as marble, her lips cracked, her hair spread around her head like a dark halo. Bandages wrapped her midsection, stained with the rust brown of dried blood, but her eyes were open. Her eyes, those fierce, burning, unbreakable eyes, were open and fixed upon the ceiling as though she were engaged in a war with God himself. Andreas dropped to his knees beside her. His voice cracked. He said, Daphne, my love, my heart, my reason for breathing. Allah be praised, you are alive. They told me you were dead. They brought me your bloodied garment and told me the Turks had killed you. I mourned you, Daphne. I tore my clothes and I mourned you, and then I found out they lied, and I rode through the night and through the next day, and I am here now and you are alive, and this is all that matters. This is all that has ever mattered. Daphne turned her head slowly. The movement cost her. Pain flickered across her face like lightning across a night sky. She said his name, just his name, Andreas. He took her hand. It was cold. He said, I am here, my love. By everything sacred, I will never leave your side again. Daphne closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had changed. The pain was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Something harder, something sharper, something that had been forged in the furnace of agony and emerged as pure, unbreakable will. She said, the thing that kept me alive, Andreas, was not your love. It was not the hope of seeing your face. Do not misunderstand me. I cherish you. But the thing that pulled me back from the edge of death, the thing that forced my heart to keep beating when every part of my body was begging to stop, was revenge. It was the burning, consuming, all-encompassing need for revenge. Andreas gripped her hand tighter. His eyes darkened. He said, and you shall have it. I swear to you, Daphne. I swear on my father's grave and on the cross of my ancestors. I will take your revenge. Those who did this to you will regret the day they were born. They will regret that their mothers carried them. They will regret every breath they took that led them to the moment when they raised a hand against you. But Daphne shook her head, slowly, deliberately. She said, no, Andreas, no. He stared at her. He said, what do you mean? She said, you will not go to them. They will come to us. They will walk into their own destruction, and they will do so willingly, eagerly, without even knowing that every step they take brings them closer to the grave I have prepared for them. Andreas leaned forward, his brow furrowed. He said, Daphne, they nearly killed you. They left you for dead in the forest. How can you ask me to wait? How can you ask me to sit here and trust that they will come? What if they do not come? What if they are too careful, too cautious, too cunning? Daphne's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a woman who had seen the future and found it satisfactory. She said, it will not take long. Trust me in this, Andreas. It will not take long at all. Andreas studied her face. He searched for doubt and found none. He searched for fear and found nothing but iron. Finally he said, what do you need? She said, prepare a ship for me. I will go to Constantinople. There are people there who will listen to what I have to say. People who have been waiting for someone to give them a reason to act. I will be that reason, Andreas. I will be the spark that sets their hatred ablaze. Andreas nodded. He said, it will be done. And Daphne lay back upon her rough bed and her eyes closed, and for a moment she looked peaceful, and then Andreas saw the corner of her mouth twitch, and he knew that behind those closed eyes she was not resting. She was planning. She was building, stone by careful stone, the architecture of someone's doom. He sat beside her in the darkness and watched her breathe, and outside the small house, the forest was silent, as though even the trees knew better than to disturb a woman in the act of designing vengeance. Now return with me to Bursa. Return to the palace where the evening light was fading, and the lamps were being lit one by servants who moved through the corridors like ghosts. Return to the chamber where Evanos sat alone, staring out of the window at nothing, his mind consumed by a problem he could not solve with a sword. It was into this chamber that Zarkute entered. Zarkute, that old warrior, that weathered pillar of the realm, whose face bore more scars than most men's shields and whose wisdom had been earned in the hardest currency known to humanity, which is suffering. He entered without knocking, because Zarkute did not knock. He had fought beside 3 generations of this family, and he considered knocking to be a formality reserved for strangers and merchants. He saw Evanos sitting there, staring at nothing, and he said, "What is this? What has happened? Evanos, you sit there with the expression of a man who has been told his horse has died, and his sword has broken, and his mother has disowned him all in the same afternoon. What consumes you so deeply?" Evanos looked up. He said, "Zarkute Saheb, I need to ask you something, but I warn you I may not like the answer." Zarkute settled himself onto the cushion beside Evanos with the careful slowness of a man whose joints had earned their complaints honestly. He said, "Ask, but if the answer displeases you, do not blame the one who speaks the truth. Blame the truth itself." Evanos took a breath. He said, "How many proposals have been made for Fatima Khatun? How many men have come to seek her hand in marriage?" Zarkute's eyebrows rose. He sat very still for a moment, then he began to count on his fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, his right hand was full. He moved to his left hand. 5, 6, 7, 8, he paused. He frowned. He went back to his right hand and started over, muttering names under his breath, and then he shook his head and said, "No, I cannot count them." Evanos felt something cold settle in his stomach. He said, "What do you mean you cannot count them?" Zarkute held up both hands and spread his fingers. He said, "I mean that my fingers are not enough. There have been many proposals for Fatima Khatun, many men from many tribes, many families, many ranks. She is the sister of the Sultan. She is a leader of the Badian. She is beautiful and she is fierce, and she is the kind of woman that men lose sleep over. Of course there have been many proposals." Evanos stood up. He paced. He said, "This is what you tell me. This is the comfort you offer. How many, Zarkute? Who are they? Do we know them? Are they among us? Do I see them every day? Do I sit beside them at council and not know that they once sought the hand of the woman I love?" Zarkute raised a calming hand. He said, "Stop, stop this. You are doing what foolish men do, which is measuring yourself against phantoms. Listen to me. 10 men may send a proposal for a single woman. 20 men may dream of her. 100 men may whisper her name into their pillows at night, but only one man will marry her, and that man, Evanos, is you." Evanos stopped packing. He looked at Zarkute. He said, "Inshallah, inshallah, let it be so." But then his face fell again and he said, "They will give her to me, will they not? Her family, the Sultan, they will consent." Zarkute said, "They will consent." Evanos said, "But I have no one. I have no family here, no father, no uncle, no elder to speak on my behalf. Who will I take with me when I go to ask for her hand? A man cannot go alone to ask for a bride. It is not done. It has never been done. Who will stand beside me?" Zarkute stared at him. Then he leaned forward and said, with a voice that carried the weight of decades of brotherhood, "What do you mean you have no one? What am I? Am I invisible? Am I a jinn that you cannot see? I am sitting right here, Evanos. I am your elder. I am your family. We will go together. We will walk into that room and we will sit before the Sultan and his mother and we will speak our case with dignity and honor. I will put my fist on the table if I have to. We will bring Fatima Khatun home with the respect she deserves." Evanos opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the door opened and Nasser Celebi entered. Nasser, that loyal, earnest, perpetually overworked administrator who carried the weight of the realm's logistics on his narrow shoulders, had apparently been listening from the corridor. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed about this, but the enthusiasm in his eyes overwhelmed any shame. He said, "My lords, my esteemed brothers, include me in this mission. I will come with you. We will go together, the 3 of us, and we will ask for her hand, and we will bring her home, by the will and command of Allah the Most High." Zarkute looked at Evanos and gestured toward Nasser. He said, "You see, now you have 2 men at your side. 2 men who will stand with you, speak for you, and if necessary, argue for you until the dawn prayer. Evanos looked at them both. His eyes glistened. He said, "Thank you, Nasser. Thank you, Zarkute Saheb. I am fortunate, I am blessed beyond measure to have you both beside me, but there is something that troubles me still. Fatima told me something. She said that her family will not give consent on the first visit. She said they will turn us away. Is this true?" Zarkute nodded slowly. He said, "It is true. They will not give consent on the first visit. This is the way of things. This is tradition. This is the test that every man must pass." Evanos spread his hands. He said, "Then how many times must we go? How many times must I stand before them and be refused before they finally agree?" Zarkute was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Evanos, the number of visits is not the real problem. The real problem is something else entirely." Evanos leaned in. He said, What is the real problem?" Zarkute exchanged a glance with Nasser. Then he said, "The Sultan and Malhan Khatun, they will be reasonable. They will listen, they will consider. But Alauddin Saheb, you know Alauddin Saheb, he is a particular man, he is a careful man. Some would say he is a man who counts every coin twice and then counts it a third time to be certain. When he sees an opportunity to set conditions, he will set conditions. And his conditions will not be small." Nasser nodded vigorously. He said, "The man who made me build a bridge in 2 days. Allah forbid he should demand gold equal to Fatima Khatun's weight, because if he does, we are all ruined." Zarkute pointed at Nasser and said, "He speaks the truth. Alauddin Saheb could ask for such a thing. He has asked for such things before. He once demanded 17 horses and a carpet from Persia for a trade agreement that should have cost nothing more than a handshake." Evanos sat down heavily. The color drained from his face. He said, "Gold equal to Fatima Khatun's weight. Do you know how much gold that is? I do not have that kind of wealth. I am a soldier. I am a commander. I have my sword and my armor and my horse and my honor. I do not have mountains of gold hidden beneath my floorboards." Zarkute said, "You do not have it." Evanos said, "No, I do not." Zarkute said, "Then without gold, you cannot take her. Not in this lifetime. Not in any lifetime. You cannot walk into the house of a sultan with empty pockets and expect to walk out with his sister." Evanos put his head in his hands. He said, "I am destroyed. I am finished. The one battle I cannot win is the one that matters most." Zarkute stood up. He placed his hand on Evanos' shoulder. He said, "Listen to me, do not despair. Despair is for men who have no God. You have Allah, and Allah is greater than all the gold in all the mines of all the world. Focus on your duties. Focus on your service. Focus on being the man that Fatima Khatun deserves, and let us go now. Let us go and pray. Salah is the remedy for every affliction. It is the answer to every question. It is the light in every darkness. Come, stand up, walk with me." He pulled Evanos to his feet. Nasser fell in beside them. And as they walked toward the prayer hall, Zarkute said, with a lightness that belied the depth of his understanding, "Prayer is the cure for everything, Evanos. Do not lose heart. What, do you think the women of this world have run out? Do you think Allah has no plan for you? Walk, pray, trust, and leave the rest to the one who never sleeps." And so they walked, 3 men, 3 soldiers of a growing empire, walking not toward a battlefield but toward a prayer mat. And in that moment, in that simple act of turning from despair to devotion, there was a power greater than any army, greater than any siege engine, greater than any fortress of stone and iron. But the world does not pause for prayers. The world does not wait while men kneel and whisper to their Creator. The world turns, and its turning grinds all things beneath it, the good and the wicked, the faithful and the faithless, the lovers and the lonely. And so it was that even as Evanos prayed for the hand of the woman he loved, even as his forehead touched the cold stone floor of the prayer hall, and his lips moved in silent supplication, events were unfolding beyond the walls of Bursa that would test every oath he had ever sworn and every bond he had ever forged. Far to the east, in the territories that bordered Shahanshah's domain, Turhan was riding. Turhan, that blade of a man, that instrument of precision and lethality, whose sword arm had never known hesitation, and whose loyalty to Orhan Saheb was as absolute as the law of gravity. He rode at the head of a column of 12 riders, his eyes scanning the ridgeline, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword with the casual readiness of a man who expected violence the way other men expected rain. They had been tracking a Byzantine patrol for 3 days. The tracks led through the valley of broken stones, across the river at its shallowest point, and into the dense woodland that Shahanshah's forces had been using as a staging ground for raids against the Muslim settlements. Turhan had lost 2 men in an ambush 2 nights prior, good men, men who had families and names and futures that would now never unfold, and the loss sat in his chest like a stone. He raised his fist, the column stopped. Ahead through the trees he could see smoke, not the smoke of a campfire, the smoke of something larger, something deliberate. He turned to Damia Khan, who rode beside him, and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "They are burning the stores. The grain stores that Abdul Rahman's men spent 3 weeks gathering. They are burning them. Damir Khan's jaw tightened. He said, "How many?" Turhan studied the smoke patterns. He listened to the sounds that the forest was making, and more importantly, the sounds it was not making. He said 20, perhaps more. They have sentries on the eastern approach. 2, maybe 3. The main body is at the stores. Damir Khan said, "We are 12, against 20. Turhan looked at him. His eyes were calm. They were always calm, even in the worst of it, even when the blood was flying and the horses were screaming and men were dying in ways that no story should ever describe. Turhan's eyes remained calm. He said, "We have been 12 against worse odds and we are still here. Send Mahmud and 3 riders around the eastern flank. They will take the sentries quietly. When I hear the owl call, we ride, straight through the center. No hesitation, no mercy. They burn our grain, we burn their courage." Damir Khan nodded. He relayed the orders. Mahmud, a lean, quiet fighter from the mountain tribes who moved through forests the way fish move through water, took 3 men and vanished into the undergrowth without a sound. The minutes passed. Turhan sat motionless on his horse. The other riders sat motionless on theirs. The forest breathed around them, indifferent to what was about to happen, indifferent to the blood that would soon water its roots. Then the owl call came. 2 notes, low and mournful, drifting through the trees like the last breath of a dying man. Turhan drew his sword. The blade caught a fragment of moonlight and threw it back at the sky like a challenge. He said one word. "Now." And they rode, 12 men on 12 horses, erupting from the tree line like a storm made of steel and fury, and the Byzantine soldiers at the grain stores had barely enough time to turn and see what was coming before it was upon them. Turhan reached the first man before the man could draw his sword. The blow was clean, final, the kind of strike that leaves no room for argument or appeal. The man fell and Turhan was already past him, already seeking the next, already moving with that terrible, beautiful efficiency that made men who watched him fight unable to decide whether they were witnessing art or atrocity. Damir Khan ploughed into the left flank, his horse knocking 2 men sideways before his sword found its work. Behind him, the riders spread out in a practiced pattern, each man knowing his role, each man trusting the men beside him, each man fighting not for glory but for survival, for the grain that would feed their families through the winter, for the principle that what is ours will not be taken by those who do not have the right. The fight lasted less time than it takes to describe it. 20 men became 12, 12 became 6, 6 became 2, who threw down their weapons and raised their hands and begged in a language that Turhan understood well enough to recognize the word for mercy. Turhan looked at them. He looked at the burning grain stores behind them. He looked at the bodies on the ground, the Muslim and the Byzantine dead lying side by side in the democracy of death, and he made a decision that would have consequences he could not foresee. He said, "Bind them, they will come with us. Orhan Sahib will decide their fate." Damir Khan looked surprised. He said, "You would spare them." Turhan sheathed his sword. He said, "I would give them to the Sultan. What happens to them after that is between them and God." They bound the 2 prisoners. They salvaged what grain they could from the stores that had not yet burned. They loaded it onto the captured horses. And then they rode back toward Bursa, 12 men who had become 10, carrying with them the spoils of a small victory and the weight of 2 lives that now depended on a sultan's judgment. And as they rode, Turhan thought about Evanos. He thought about Fatima. He thought about the strange, unpredictable mathematics of love, how a man who could face 20 enemy soldiers without flinching could be reduced to helplessness by a woman's smile. He thought about this and he almost smiled himself, but then the pain in his shoulder where a Byzantine blade had nicked him reminded him that smiling was a luxury he could not yet afford. Meanwhile, in the palace at Bursa, the next morning unfolded with its own set of trials. Nasser Celebi walked beside Orhan Sahib through the long corridor that led from the council chamber to the outer courtyard. Nasser's brow was furrowed, his hands clasped behind his back, his stride slightly shorter than the Sultan's, which meant he had to take an extra step every few paces to keep up. This irritated him, but he had long since accepted it as the physical metaphor for his relationship with the Sultan, always working twice as hard to maintain pace with a man who seemed to move through the world with an effortless authority that Nasser could only admire and envy. Nasser said, "My Sultan, as I mentioned before, there are several fortresses that require urgent repair and reinforcement before we can consider any further expansion. The walls at 3 of our eastern outposts are crumbling. The watchtower at the northern pass has a crack in its foundation that, if left unaddressed, will cause the entire structure to collapse before winter. I have assigned soldiers to the work, but our numbers are insufficient. We are stretched too thin. I therefore requested laborers from among the common people to assist in the construction." Orhan Sahib walked in silence for a moment. Then he said, completing Nasser's thought before Nasser could complete it himself, but the people objected. They refused the labor, and they obtained a fatwa from the Qazi, a ruling that declares your requisition of their labor to be impermissible under Islamic law. Nasser nodded. He said, yes, my sultan, that is precisely what happened. They had reached the courtyard where the Qazi waited. The Qazi was an elderly man with a white beard and eyes that carried the particular clarity of someone who had spent his entire life in the pursuit of a single, unwavering principle. Justice, as he understood it, was not flexible. It did not bend for sultans. It did not bow to convenience. It simply was. Orhan Sahib regarded the Qazi with respect. Whatever frustration he felt, he did not allow it to touch his face or his voice. He said, Qazi Effendi, tell me, what Nasser Celebi has done, requisitioning labor from the common people for the repair of the fortresses, is this against the Sharia? Is this what you have ruled? The Qazi met the Sultan's gaze without flinching. He said, my Sultan, if the people are unwilling, if they have not given their consent, if they are being compelled to leave their own work, their own fields, their own trades, in order to perform labor for the state without compensation and without agreement, then yes, it is not permissible. The Sharia protects the rights of the laborer. It protects the right of every man to earn his livelihood without unlawful interference. I have issued my ruling in accordance with these principles, and I stand by it. Orhan Sahib looked at Nasser. Nasser looked at the ground. The silence was heavy. It was the kind of silence that forms when an immovable principle meets an undeniable necessity, and neither is willing to yield. Then the Sultan turned his gaze outward, toward the courtyard where his family waited. Malhun Khatun stood with the quiet dignity that had characterized her from the first day Orhan had known her, a dignity that was not performed but simply existed, like the strength of a mountain that does not need to announce itself. Beside her stood Nilufer, holding young Murad, and the boy's eyes were wide and bright, taking in the world with the hungry curiosity of a child who did not yet understand that the world he was inheriting was one of blades and blood and impossible choices. Halima stood nearby and Fatima beside her, and when the Princess Esportia descended the stairs and joined them, Halima whispered, the princess has arrived. Fatima, with the gentleness that lived beneath her warrior's exterior, said, do not make a fuss, Halima. Let her come in peace. Esportia's eyes moved across the gathering and settled on young Murad in Nilufer's arms, and something passed across her face, a tenderness, a longing, a recognition of something she could not yet name. But this is not the moment to explore what that look meant. That story belongs to another night, another fire, another telling. Then Ayaz, the herald, appeared at the doorway and said in the formal cadence that his position demanded, make way. Sultan Orhan Ghazi approaches. And Orhan Sahib emerged into the courtyard, and the light of the late morning sun fell across his face, and he looked older than he had looked a year ago, older and wiser and more burdened, because wisdom and burden are twins who are born together and die together and cannot be separated by any force known to man. He addressed the Qazi one final time before dismissing him. He said, we must not rush to judgment in this matter. Let us take time. Let us think carefully. There is a solution that serves both justice and necessity, and we will find it. Qazi Effendi, I will consider your ruling with the weight it deserves. The Qazi bowed and prepared to depart, but before he left, the Sultan turned to Khalil, who stood silently at the edge of the gathering, watching, listening, processing, as Khalil always did. Khalil, who had served as Qazi in Bilesik, who understood the law not as an abstraction, but as a living thing that must breathe and adapt without ever losing its core. Orhan Sahib said, Khalil, you have served as a Qazi. You have sat in judgment over disputes between men. You have applied the Sharia to the messy, complicated, contradictory realities of human life. What is your view on this matter? Khalil stepped forward. He spoke with the measured precision of a man who has thought deeply about what he is about to say and has chosen each word with care. He said, my Sultan, the Qazi Effendi is correct in his principle. We cannot compel men to abandon their livelihoods and labor for the state against their will. This is a violation of their rights, and the Sharia is clear on this point. He paused. The courtyard was silent. Then he continued. He said, however, there is another principle that must also be considered. Allah the Most High has commanded the believers to strive in his cause with their wealth and their lives. Jihad is not limited to the battlefield. The defense of Islamic lands, the fortification of the borders that protect Muslim communities from invasion and destruction, this is also jihad. It is as sacred as wielding a sword in battle. It is as essential as standing in the ranks on the day of conflict. He looked at the Qazi, he looked at Nasser, he looked at the Sultan, and then he said, therefore, my proposal is this. From every household in which there are at least 2 able-bodied men, 1 man shall be called to serve in the construction and repair of the fortresses. This ensures that no family is left without a provider. This ensures that the fields are not abandoned. This ensures that the economy of the people is not destroyed. But it also ensures that the fortresses are repaired, that the borders are secured, that the land of Islam is defended. This is the balance that the Sharia demands, and this is the balance that we must strike. The courtyard was quiet for a long moment. Then Orhan Sahib spoke. He said one word, excellent. And then he turned to the Qazi and said, I will consider this proposal alongside your ruling. I will make my decision and announce it in due course. You may go, Qazi Effendi. Thank you for your counsel. Nasser Celebi escorted the Qazi out of the courtyard, and as they walked, the Qazi said nothing, and Nasser said nothing, and the silence between them was the silence of two men who had each been partially right and partially wrong, and who were both wise enough to recognize it. And Orhan Sahib stood alone in the courtyard for a moment, watching them go, and then he turned and looked at the sky, and the sky looked back at him with the same blank, eternal indifference that it has shown to every ruler who has ever stood beneath it, and asked it for answers it cannot give. But the story does not end here. Stories never end where you think they will. They have their own logic, their own momentum, their own insistence on continuing long after the characters wish they could rest. Because even as Orhan Sahib deliberated on the question of labor and law, even as Evenos prayed for the wealth he did not possess, even as Turhan rode homeward with prisoners and salvaged grain, the larger game was moving. The chessboard of empires was shifting, and the pieces that were moving most dangerously were the ones you could not see. Shahanshah knew this. Shahanshah, that master of whispers and shadows, that ruler who preferred poison to the sword and deception to direct confrontation, was not idle. He never was. While Orhan Sahib debated the fine points of Islamic jurisprudence, Shahanshah was meeting with Burhan Faladios in a darkened room in a fortress that the maps did not show, and the scouts had not found. Burhan Faladios sat across from him, his face half-lit by a single candle, his eyes reflecting the flame like twin harbors of barely contained rage. Burhan was not a man who enjoyed patience. He was not a man who found comfort in waiting. He was a man who solved problems the way lightning solves the problem of distance between cloud and earth, swiftly, violently, and with absolute finality. He said, Your messengers speak in circles, Shahanshah. They bring me words wrapped in more words wrapped in more words, and when I unwrap them all, I find nothing at the center. No plan, no commitment, no action, just more words. I did not come here for words. I came here because you promised me Yakid's head and the keys to the western passes. Where are they? Shahanshah smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who has lived so long among lies that the truth has become a foreign language he can no longer speak. He said, Patience, Faladios. The western passes will be yours. Yakid will answer for his treachery, but not yet, not now. The timing must be precise. Orhan is distracted by internal disputes. His commanders are scattered. His attention is divided between love and law and labor. This is the moment to plant seeds, not to harvest. The harvest will come when the seeds have grown deep enough roots that no storm can tear them out. Burhan leaned forward. The candlelight made his scars look deeper than they were. He said, I am not a farmer, Shahanshah. I do not plant seeds. I cut down what stands before me. Give me a target and I will destroy it. Give me an army and I will lead it. But do not ask me to sit here and watch the grass grow while Yakid breathes the same air as free men. Shahanshah said, Yakid is no longer free. He is a prisoner of his own choices. Every day he lives is a day closer to the reckoning you desire, but his destruction must serve a larger purpose. If you kill him now, he dies a traitor and his name is forgotten within a week. But if you let me use him, if you let me turn his treachery into a weapon, then his destruction will not just end his life. It will crack the foundation of Orhan's empire. It will turn brother against brother. It will make every man in Orhan's army look at his neighbor and wonder if he too is a traitor waiting to strike. Burhan studied Shahanshah's face. He said, You are a dangerous man. Shahanshah said, I am a useful man. There is a difference. Dangerous men burn everything. Useful men burn only what needs burning and build something on the ashes. Burhan said, And what do you plan to build? Shahanshah said, An empire, but not mine. Yours. Give me time, Faladios. Give me time and I will give you everything you have ever wanted. Burhan was silent for a long moment. Then he stood. He said, I will give you until the first snow. If Yakid is not dead by then, I will come back here and burn this fortress to the ground and you inside it. He walked out without waiting for a response. Shahanshah watched him go, and when the door closed and the room was dark again except for the single candle, Shahanshah laughed. It was a quiet laugh, barely more than an exhalation, but it carried in it the sound of a man who has just manipulated another man exactly where he wanted him and feels no remorse about it whatsoever. The candle flickered, the shadows danced, and somewhere in the darkness, Yakid's fate was being written in an ink that only God could read. But God reads all things, and God's patience is not the patience of men. It is vaster, deeper, more terrifying in its completeness. For every scheme that Shahanshah devised, for every web he wove, for every lie he planted in the fertile soil of men's ambitions and fears, there was a reckoning that awaited him, patient as the grave, certain as the dawn. Days passed after these events, days in which the mundane machinery of the empire continued to turn. Tamya Boga oversaw the training of new recruits in the courtyard, young men who had come from the villages with nothing but their fathers' swords and their mothers' prayers, and who would leave either as warriors of the faith or as corpses wrapped in white cloth. He drove them hard because the world was hard, and a man who was not prepared to meet its hardness would be broken by it. Mustafa managed the supply lines, counting barrels of grain and bolts of cloth and jars of oil, with the meticulous attention of a man who understood that armies do not march on courage alone. They march on bread and water and shoes that do not fall apart after 3 days of walking. Abdul Rahman and his men rebuilt what they could of the burned grain stores, working in silence, their faces grim, their hands blistered, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that what took 3 weeks to build had been destroyed in an hour. And through it all, Orhan Sahib moved among them. He inspected the training grounds. He reviewed the supply tallies. He visited the construction sites where the fortress repairs were underway, now staffed by men drawn from the households according to Carlil's proposal, 1 man from every family with 2 or more able-bodied men, a solution that was neither perfect nor permanent but was sufficient for the moment, which is all that any solution in a time of war can ever be. He spoke with Altuddin Sahib about the diplomatic dispatches that had arrived from the Eastern Emirates, letters written in careful calligraphy that said much and meant little, the eternal language of politics. He consulted with Zarkan about the condition of the cavalry horses, many of whom were showing signs of exhaustion from the constant patrols. He listened to Kulad's report on the morale of the garrison, which was stable but not strong, held together by faith and routine, and the knowledge that the Sultan cared about their welfare. And at night, when the palace was quiet and the candles had burned down to stubs, and the last of the petitioners had been heard and dismissed, Orhan Sahib sat alone in his chamber and thought about Carlil's words. He thought about the balance between justice and necessity. He thought about the weight of leadership, how it was not the weight of a crown, but the weight of every single life that depended on his decisions, every family that would eat or starve, every soldier who would live or die, every child who would grow up in peace or in the shadow of war. He thought about his father. He thought about the lessons that had been passed down to him not in words but in actions, in the way his father had governed, with firmness and compassion in equal measure, with the understanding that a leader who is too harsh will be hated, and a leader who is too lenient will be despised, and a leader who is both harsh and lenient in exactly the right proportions, and at exactly the right moments will be remembered long after his bones have turned to dust. He thought about Fatima and Evanos. He had heard, of course, sultans hear everything, even the things that are whispered in empty rooms. He knew that Evanos intended to ask for his sister's hand. He knew that Evanos was a good man, a brave man, a faithful man. He also knew that Alauddin would make the process as difficult as possible, not out of malice, but out of that particular form of love that expresses itself through obstruction, the love that says, "I will not make this easy for you, because nothing worth having should be easy to obtain." He allowed himself a small smile. Then the smile faded, because smiles, like everything else in a sultan's life, were a luxury he could rarely afford. And far to the west, on a ship that cut through dark waters like a blade through silk, Daphne stood at the prow and looked toward Constantinople. The wind tore at her hair. The salt spray strung the wounds that had not yet fully healed. But she did not flinch. She did not waver. She stood there with the terrible stillness of a woman who has passed through death and emerged on the other side with a clarity of purpose that no living person can match. Andreas had prepared the ship as she had asked. He had given her his best men, sailors who knew the currents and the tides, fighters who could defend the vessel if it was intercepted. He had given her gold and documents and letters of introduction to contacts in the Byzantine capital. He had given her everything she needed, and as the ship had pulled away from the shore, he had stood on the dock and watched it go, and something in his chest had told him that the woman he loved was sailing towards something that would change everything, and that when she returned, if she returned, neither she nor the world she returned to would be the same. Daphne did not look back. She did not need to. The past was behind her, and behind her was where it would stay. The future was ahead, dark and vast, and full of the terrible possibility that only vengeance can provide. She whispered into the wind. She said, "They will come to me, all of them. The Sultan and his commanders, the soldiers and the spies, the men who burned my home and left me for dead in the forest. They will come to me, and when they do, they will find not a victim but a trap, not a wounded woman but a weapon. And by the time they understand what I am, it will be too late. It will be far, far too late." The ship sailed on. The water was black. The stars were cold. and the future, that great unknown country from which no traveler returns unchanged, lay open before her like a wound that would not close. Back in Bursa, the dawn call to prayer echoed across the valley, carried by the wind from minaret to minaret, from mountain to mountain, from the lips of the muezzin to the ears of every soul who lay sleeping or waking or somewhere in between. Evanos heard it. He was already awake. He had not slept. He had spent the night calculating his wealth, counting every coin, every asset, every possession that could be converted to gold, and the total had fallen so short of what he feared a Lordin would demand that he had wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, except that laughing would have required a lightness of heart that he did not possess. He rose, he performed his ablutions. He stood on his prayer mat and raised his hands, and said the words that had been said by billions of Muslims before him, and would be said by billions after, the words that connect every soul to every other soul across the vast, incomprehensible ocean of time. Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest. And in that moment, standing alone in his room with the first light of dawn creeping across the floor like a promise that might or might not be kept, Evanos felt something shift inside him. Not a solution, not an answer, but something more fundamental than either of those things, a certainty. A quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever was meant to be would be, and that his task was not to control the outcome, but to trust the one who controlled all outcomes, the one who had written the fate of every atom before the first atom existed, the one who had said in his holy book, and perhaps you hate a thing and it is good for you, and perhaps you love a thing and it is bad for you, and Allah knows while you do not know. He prostrated, his forehead touched the cold stone, and he stayed there longer than the prayer required, because sometimes the only honest response to the impossible complexity of life is to put your face against the ground and admit that you are small and the universe is large and the distance between what you want and what you will receive is a distance that only God can bridge. When he rose, the sun had cleared the mountains. The palace was waking. The sounds of life, footsteps and voices, and the clatter of utensils and the distant whinny of horses filled the corridors like water filling a vessel. And Evanos squared his shoulders, and he stepped out of his room, and he walked toward the day that awaited him, not knowing what it would bring, not knowing whether it would end in joy or sorrow, but knowing, with the deep and unassailable faith of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything left to hope for, that whatever came, he would face it standing. Because that is what soldiers do, that is what lovers do, that is what men of faith do, they face whatever comes, standing, always standing. And across the empire, in 100 different places, 100 different stories were unfolding simultaneously, each one connected to every other, each one pulling the threads of fate in directions that no human mind could fully comprehend. Turhan was riding home with his prisoners and his salvaged grain. Burhan Faladios was sharpening his sword and counting the days until the first snow. Shahanshah was writing letters in coded script to agents embedded in places that would horrify anyone who knew the truth. Daphne was sailing toward a city of intrigues. Carla was studying ancient texts by candlelight, searching for precedents that might guide the Sultan's decisions. Tamia Boga was watching a young recruit struggle with a training sword and deciding whether to help him or let him struggle, because sometimes the only way to learn is to fail. Mustafa was reconciling ledgers and discovering discrepancies that troubled him. Abdul Rahman was praying over the ashes of the grain stores and asking God to replace what had been lost with something better. And Malhun Khartoum was sitting with Nilufer and speaking quietly about the future of young Murad, about the kind of prince he should become, about the virtues that must be instilled in him before the world had a chance to corrupt them. All of these stories were happening at once. All of them were part of the same vast, intricate, impossibly complex tapestry that was the story of this empire, this time, this place, these people. And at the center of it all, holding it together by sheer force of will and faith, and the stubborn refusal to let it fall apart, was one man. Orhan Sahib. He stood at the window of his chamber and looked out over the city that his father had dreamed of and he had built. The minarets and the markets, the barracks and the bathhouses, the walls that kept the enemy out and the faith that kept the people in. All of it, his responsibility, his burden, his privilege. And the war was not over. The war was never over. It shifted and changed and wore new faces, but it was always there, always waiting, always hungry for the blood of men who thought they had earned the right to rest. There would be no rest, not tonight, not tomorrow, not until the work was done, and the work, the great work of building something that would outlast the builders, would never truly be done. Orhan Sahib turned from the window. He walked toward his council chamber. There were decisions to make, borders to secure, alliances to forge and enemies to confront, and a sister to give in marriage and a faith to uphold and a people to protect. The door closed behind him, and the story continued. As it always does. As it always will. For as long as men draw breath and swing swords and kneel in prayer, and fall in love and fight for things that are worth more than their lives, the story will continue. It is written, and it is far, far from finished. The night had not yet released its grip on Bursa when Orhan Sahib's eyes opened. Not slowly, not with the lazy confusion of a man dragged from pleasant dreams, but instantly, completely, the way a commander's eyes open when something in the air has changed. He lay still for a moment, listening. The palace was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of the night watch, the rhythmic footsteps on stone, the low murmur of guards exchanging words at the gate were absent, replaced by something else. A thickness in the silence, a weight. He rose. He did not call for his attendants. He dressed in the dark with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent more nights sleeping in armor on open ground than in silk on palace beds. His hand found his sword before it found his sandals, because priorities are revealed not in what a man says, but in what he reaches for first. The corridor outside his chamber was lit by a single oil lamp that had burned low, its flame gasping like a dying man's last breath. Orhan moved through the shadows toward the outer courtyard, and as he turned the corner, he found Ayaz standing at the gate with a face that looked as though it had been carved from grey stone. Ayaz said, "My Sultan, a rider has come." Orhan said, "From where?" Ayaz said, "From the eastern border, from Abdul Rahman's outpost. The rider's horse collapsed at the gate. The animal is dead. The rider is barely alive. He carried this." He held out a piece of leather, not paper, not parchment, leather, torn from something, a saddlebag perhaps, or a boot, and on it, scratched with the point of a knife in letters that were barely legible, were 3 words. "They are coming." Orhan took the leather. He held it close to the lamp, and read the words, and his jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed, and for a moment he was perfectly still, the way a hawk is still in the instant before it folds its wings and drops from the sky like a stone wrapped in feathers and fury. Then he said, "Wake Turhan, wake Damia Khan, wake Khalil and Nasser Celebi. Send word to Tamia Boga at the training grounds. I want every commander in the council chamber before the dawn prayer. Every one of them, Ayaz, no exceptions." Ayaz bowed and vanished into the darkness. Orhan looked down at the leather one more time. "They are coming." 3 words. 3 words that meant the end of deliberation and the beginning of action. 3 words that meant Shahanshah had stopped planting seeds and started swinging his scythe. Orhan crushed the leather in his fist. He whispered, "Then let them come. Let them come and find us ready." He walked toward the council chamber, and behind him, the palace began to wake, not with the gentle stirring of a new day, but with the sharp, electric urgency of a body that has been struck and must now decide whether to fall or fight. The council chamber filled slowly and then all at once. Turhan arrived first because Turhan always arrived first. He had not been sleeping either. He had been in the stables, tending to a horse that had taken a wound during the skirmish at the grain stores, wrapping the animal's leg with the same careful attention he would have given a fallen comrade. When Ayaz's messenger found him, he simply wiped his hands, picked up his sword, and walked. He entered the chamber and saw Orhan standing at the great table where the maps were spread, and he read the Sultan's posture the way a sailor reads the sky, and he knew. He said nothing. He took his place at the table and waited. Damia Khan came next, his face still bearing the crease marks of a pillow and his eyes sharp with the particular alertness of a man who has been woken from deep sleep, and whose body has flooded itself with the ancient chemicals of alarm. Behind him came Mahmud, silent as always, his presence announced not by sound, but by the subtle displacement of air that occurs when a dangerous man enters a room. Khalil arrived with a scroll tucked under his arm, because Khalil never went anywhere without something to read, as though he feared that a moment might come when knowledge would be needed, and he would be found wanting. Nasser Celebi came hurrying in with ink stains on his fingers and a quill still tucked behind his ear, looking as though he had been roused from the middle of a complex calculation and was still trying to finish it in his head. Tamia Boga was the last to arrive. He filled the doorway with his massive frame, his scarred hands hanging at his sides like weapons that had been temporarily holstered. He looked around the room, assessed the faces of every man present, and positioned himself near the door, because Tamia Boga always positioned himself near the door. Not because he planned to leave, but because he planned to be the last line of defense if anything came through it. Orhan waited until they were all present. Then he placed the piece of leather on the table, face up, and let them read it. The silence that followed was the silence of men who understand what war costs and are calculating whether they can afford it. Turhan spoke first. He said, "Abdul Rahman's outpost. That is 3 days' ride from here. If they sent this message when the threat was first spotted, we have perhaps 2 days before whatever is coming reaches our outer perimeter. Perhaps less if they are moving fast." Damia Khan said, "Do we know what is coming?" "An army, a raiding party, a diplomatic delegation with swords hidden under their robes. Orhan said, "We do not know the size. We do not know the composition. What we know is that Abdul Rahman does not send messages written in blood on boot leather unless the situation is beyond his ability to contain. Abdul Rahman has held that outpost against raids and skirmishes for 2 years without asking for help. If he is asking now, what is coming is not a skirmish." Nasser Celebi cleared his throat. He said, "My Sultan, our supply situation is not what I would wish it to be. The burning of the grain stores cost us significantly. We have enough provisions for the garrison and the city for perhaps 40 days if we ration carefully. If we need to feed a field army on the march, that number drops to 20, perhaps 15. Khalil said, "And the fortress repairs are not complete. The eastern outposts are still vulnerable. If the enemy pushes past Abdul Rahman and reaches our secondary line, they will find walls with holes large enough to ride a horse through." Tarhan said, "Then we do not let them reach our secondary line. We meet them in the field. We choose the ground. We fight on our terms, not theirs." Orhan looked at him. He said, "Where?" Tarhan leaned over the map. His finger traced the route from Abdul Rahman's outpost toward Bursa, following the valleys and passes that any army would have to use. He stopped at a point where 2 valleys converged, creating a narrow passage flanked on both sides by steep, forested ridges. He said, "Here, the narrows of Karar Dera. The passage is wide enough for perhaps 50 men abreast. If we hold the ridges, we can rain arrows and stones down on them while they are compressed in the valley. They cannot flank us because the terrain will not permit it. They cannot go around because the mountains on either side would add 4 days to their march. They must come through, and when they do, we will be waiting." Damir Khan studied the map. He said, "It is a strong position, but holding the ridges requires men. How many can we spare from the garrison without leaving the city undefended?" Orhan said, "That is the question. That has always been the question. Every soldier we send to the field is a soldier taken from the walls. Every wall left unmanned is an invitation to those who watch and wait for weakness." He turned to Tamir Boga. He said, "How many of the new recruits are ready?" Tamir Boga's expression did not change. It rarely did. He said, "Ready is a word that means different things, my Sultan. Ready to hold a sword without cutting themselves, perhaps 200. Ready to stand in a line and not run when the enemy charges, perhaps 150. Ready to fight and kill and survive against seasoned soldiers, perhaps 80, perhaps fewer." Orhan nodded. He said, 80 men who can fight, 200 who can hold a position if the position is strong enough. That is something, not enough, but something." He looked around the room. He looked at each man individually, meeting their eyes, measuring their resolve, searching for doubt and finding none. These were men who had been tested, not by examination or ritual, but by the simple,